secret talking and conspiring, which forms the delight of female life, Amelia, coming up to Rebecca and taking her two little hands in hers, said, "Rebecca, I see it all." Rebecca kissed her. And regarding this delightful secret, not one syllable more was said by either of the young women. But it was destined to come out before long. Some short period after the above events, and Miss Rebecca Sharp still remaining at her patroness's house in Park Lane, one more hatchment might have been seen in Great Gaunt Street, figuring amongst the many which usually ornament that dismal quarter. It was over Sir Pitt Crawley's house, but it did not indicate the worthy baronet's demise. It was a feminine hatchment, and indeed, a few years back had served as a funeral compliment to Sir Pitt's old mother, the late Dowager Lady Crawley. Its period of service over, the hatchment had come down from the front of the house and lived in retirement somewhere in the back premises of Sir Pitt's mansion. It reappeared now for poor Rose Dawson. Sir Pitt was a widower again. The arms quartered on the shield, along with his own, were not, to be sure, poor Rose's. She had no arms, but the cherubs painted on the scutcheon answered as well for her as for Sir Pitt's mother, and Resurgam was written under the coat, flanked by the Crawley dove and serpent. Arms and hatchments, Resurgam. Here is an opportunity for moralizing. Mr. Crawley had tended that otherwise friendless bedside. She went out of the world strengthened by such words and comfort as he could give her. For many years, his was the only kindness she ever knew, the only friendship that solaced in any way that feeble, lonely soul. Her heart was dead long before her body. She had sold it to become Sir Pitt Crawley's wife. Mothers and daughters are making the same bargain every day in Vanity Fair. When the demise took place, her husband was in London attending to some of his innumerable schemes and busy with his endless lawyers. He had found time, nevertheless, to call often in Park Lane and to dispatch many notes to Rebecca, entreating her, enjoining her, commanding her to return to her young pupils in the country, who were now utterly without companionship during their mother's illness. But Miss Crawley would not hear of her departure, for though she was no lady of fashion in London, who would desert her friends more complacently as soon as she was tired of their society, and though few tired of them sooner, yet as long as her engagement lasted, her attachment was prodigious, and she clung still with the greatest energy to Rebecca. The news of Lady Crawley's death provoked no more grief or comment than might have been expected in Miss Crawley's family circle. "I suppose I must put off my party for the 3rd, Miss Crawley said, and added after a pause, "I hope my brother will have the decency not to marry again." "What a confounded rage Pitt will be in if he does," Rawdon remarked, with his usual regard for his elder brother. Rebecca said nothing. She seemed by far the gravest and most impressed of the family. She left the room before Rawdon went away that day, but they met by chance below, as he was going away after taking leave, and had a parley together. On the morrow, as Rebecca was gazing from the window, she startled Miss Crawley, who was placidly occupied with a French novel, crying out in an alarmed tone, "Here's Sir Pitt, ma'am!" And the baronet's knock followed this announcement. "My dear, I can't see him. I won't see him. Tell Bowles not at home, or go downstairs and say I'm too ill to receive anyone. My nerves really won't bear my brother at this moment," cried out Miss Crawley, and resumed the novel. "She's too ill to see you, sir," Rebecca said, tripping down to Sir Pitt, who was preparing to ascend. "So much the better," Sir Pitt answered. "I want to see you, Miss Becky. Come along with me into the parlor." And they entered that apartment together. I want you back at Queen's Crawley, miss, the baronet said, fixing his eyes upon her and taking off his black gloves and his hat with its great crape hatband. His eyes had such a strange look and fixed upon her so steadfastly that Rebecca Sharp almost began to tremble. I hope to come soon, she said in a low voice, as soon as Miss Crawley is better, and return to the dear children. You've said so these last 3 months, Becky, replied Sir Pitt. And still you go hanging on to my sister, who'll fling you off like an old shoe when she's wore you out. I tell you I want you. I'm going back to the funeral. Will you come back, yes or no? I daren't. I don't think it would be right to be alone with you, sir, Becky said, seemingly in great agitation. I say again, I want you, Sir Pitt said, thumping the table. I can't get on without you. I didn't see what it was till you went away. The house all goes wrong. It's not the same place. All my accounts has got muddled again. You must come back. Do come back, dear Becky, do come. Come? As what, sir? Rebecca gasped out. Come as Lady Crawley, if you like, the baronet said, grasping his crape hat. There, will that satisfy you? Come back and be my wife. You're fit for it. Birth be hanged. You're as good a lady as I ever see. You got more brains in your little finger than any baronet's wife in the country. Will you come, yes or no? Oh, Sir Pitt, Rebecca said, very much moved. Say yes, Becky, Sir Pitt continued. I'm an old man, but a good 'un. I'm good for 20 years. I'll make you happy, see if I don't. You shall do what you like, spend what you like, and have it all your way. I'll make you a settlement. I'll do everything reg'lar. Look here. And the old man fell down on his knees and leered at her like a satyr. Rebecca started back, a picture of consternation. In the course of this history, we have never seen her lose her presence of mind. But she did now, and wept some of the most genuine tears that ever fell from her eyes. Oh, Sir Pitt, she said. Oh, sir, I'm married already. Chapter 15, in which Rebecca's husband appears for a short time. Every reader of A Sentimental Turn, and we desire no other, must have been pleased with the tableau with which the last act of our little drama concluded. For what can be prettier than an image of Love on his knees before Beauty? But when Love heard that awful confession from Beauty that she was married already, he bounced up from his attitude of humility on the carpet, uttering exclamations which caused poor little Beauty to be more frightened than she was when she made her avowal. Married? You're joking, the baronet cried, after the first explosion of rage and wonder. You're making fun of me, Becky. Who'd ever go to marry you without a shilling to your fortune? Married, married, Rebecca said in an agony of tears, her voice choking with emotion, her handkerchief up to her ready eyes, fainting against the mantelpiece, a figure of woe, fit to melt the most obdurate heart. Oh, Sir Pitt, dear Sir Pitt, do not think me ungrateful for all your goodness to me. It is only your generosity that has extorted my secret. Generosity be hanged, Sir Pitt roared out. Who is it to, then you're married? Where was it? Let me come back with you to the country, sir. Let me watch over you as faithfully as ever. Don't separate me from dear Queen's Crawley. The feller has left you, has he? The baronet said, beginning, as he fancied, to comprehend. Well, Becky, come back if you like. You can't eat your cake and have it. Anyways, I made you a fair offer. Come back as governess. You shall have it all your own way. She held out one hand. She cried, fit to break her heart. Her ringlets fell over her face, and over the marble mantelpiece where she laid it. So the rascal ran off, eh? Sir Pitt said, with a hideous attempt at consolation. Never mind, Becky. I'll take care of ye. Oh, sir, it would be the pride of my life to go back to Queen's Crawley and take care of the children, and of you as formerly, when you said you were pleased with the services of your little Rebecca. When I think of what you have just offered me, my heart fills with gratitude, indeed it does. I can't be your wife, sir. Let me be your daughter. Saying which, Rebecca went down on her knees in a most tragical way, and taking Sir Pitt's horny black hand between her own two, which were very pretty and white and soft as satin, looked up in his face with an expression of exquisite pathos and confidence, when the door opened and Miss Crawley sailed in. Mrs. Firkin and Miss Briggs, who happened by chance to be at the parlor door soon after the baronet and Rebecca entered the apartment, had also seen accidentally through the keyhole the old gentleman prostrate before the governess, and had heard the generous proposal which he made her. It was scarcely out of his mouth when Mrs. Firkin and Miss Briggs had streamed up the stairs, had rushed into the drawing-room where Miss Crawley was reading the French novel, and had given that old lady the astounding intelligence that Sir Pitt was on his knees, proposing to Miss Sharp. And if you calculate the time for the above dialogue to take place, the time for Briggs and Firkin to fly to the drawing-room, the time for Miss Crawley to be astonished and to drop her volume of Pigot le Brun, and the time for her to come downstairs, you will see how exactly accurate this history is, and how Miss Crawley must have appeared at the very instant when Rebecca had assumed the attitude of humility. "It is the lady on the ground, and not the gentleman," Miss Crawley said, with a look and voice of great scorn. "They told me that you were on your knees, Sir Pitt. Do kneel once more, and let me see this pretty couple." "I have thanked Sir Pitt Crawley, ma'am," Rebecca said, rising, "and have told him that I never can become Lady Crawley." "Refused him?" Miss Crawley said, more bewildered than ever. Briggs and Firkin at the door opened the eyes of astonishment and the lips of wonder. "Yes, refused," Rebecca said with a sad, tearful voice. "And am I to credit my ears that you absolutely proposed to her, Sir Pitt?" the old lady asked. "Yes," said the baronet, "I did." "And she refused you, as she says?" "Yes," Sir Pitt said, his features on a broad grin. "It does not seem to break your heart at any rate," Miss Crawley remarked. "Not a bit," answered Sir Pitt with a coolness and good humor which set Miss Crawley almost mad with bewilderment, that an old gentleman of station should fall on his knees to a penniless governess, and burst out laughing because she refused to marry him. That a penniless governess should refuse a baronet with 4,000 a year. These were mysteries which Miss Crawley could never comprehend. It surpassed any complications of intrigue in her favorite Pigot le Brun. "I'm glad you think it good sport, brother," she continued, groping wildly through his amazement. "Famous," said Sir Pitt. "Who'd have thought it? What a sly little devil. What a little fox it was," he muttered to himself, chuckling with pleasure. "Who'd have thought what?" cries Miss Crawley, stamping with her foot. "Pray, Miss Sharp, are you waiting for the Prince Regent's divorce, that you don't think our family good enough for you?" "My attitude," Rebecca said, "when you came in, ma'am, did not look as if I despised such an honor as this noble man has deigned to offer me. Do you think I have no heart? Have you all loved me and been so kind to the poor orphan, deserted girl, and I am to feel nothing? Oh, my friends, oh, my benefactors, may not my love, my life, my duty try to repay the confidence you have shown me? Do you grudge me even gratitude, Miss Crawley? It is too much. My heart is too full." And she sank down in a chair so pathetically that most of the audience present were perfectly melted with her sadness. "Whether you marry me or not, you're a good little girl, Becky, and I'm your friend, mind," said Sir Pitt, and putting on his crape-bound hat, he walked away, greatly to Rebecca's relief, for it was evident that her secret was unrevealed to Miss Crawley, and she had the advantage of a brief reprieve. Putting her handkerchief to her eyes, and nodding away honest Briggs, who would have followed her upstairs, she went up to her apartment, while Briggs and Miss Crawley, in a high state of excitement, remained to discuss the strange event, and Firkin, not less moved, dived down into the kitchen regions and talked of it with all the male and female company there. And so impressed was Mrs. Firkin with the news that she thought proper to ride off by that very night's post, with her humble duty to Mrs. Bute Crawley and the family at the rectory, and Sir Pitt has been and proposed for to marry Miss Sharp, wherein she has refused him, to the wonder of all. The two ladies in the dining room, where worthy Miss Briggs was delighted to be admitted once more to confidential conversation with her patroness, wondered to their heart's content at Sir Pitt's offer and Rebecca's refusal. Briggs very acutely suggesting that there must have been some obstacle in the shape of a previous attachment, otherwise no young woman in her senses would ever have refused so advantageous a proposal. "You would have accepted it yourself, wouldn't you, Briggs?" Miss Crawley said kindly. "Would it not be a privilege to be Miss Crawley's sister?" Briggs replied with meek evasion. "Well, Becky would have made a good Lady Crawley after all," Miss Crawley remarked, who was mollified by the girl's refusal, and very liberal and generous now there was no call for her sacrifices. "She has brains in plenty, much more wit in her little finger than you have, my poor dear Briggs, in all your head. Her manners are excellent, now I have formed her. She is a Montmorency, Briggs, and blood is something, though I despise it for my part. And she would have held her own against those pompous, stupid Hampshire people, much better than that unfortunate ironmonger's daughter." Briggs coincided as usual, and the previous attachment was then discussed in conjectures. "Your poor, friendless creatures are always having some foolish tender," Miss Crawley said. "You yourself, you know, were in love with a writing master. Don't cry, Briggs, you're always crying, and it won't bring him to life again. And I suppose this unfortunate Becky has been silly and sentimental too, some apothecary or house steward or painter or young curate or something of that sort." Poor thing," says Briggs, who was thinking of 24 years back, and that hectic young writing master whose lock of yellow hair, and whose letters, beautiful in their illegibility, she cherished in her old desk upstairs. Poor thing, says Briggs. Once more she was a fresh-cheeked lass of 18. She was at evening church, and the hectic writing master and she were quavering out of the same psalm book. After such conduct on Rebecca's part, Miss Crawley said enthusiastically, "Our family should do something. Find out who is the object, Briggs. I'll set him up in a shop, or order my portrait of him, you know, or speak to my cousin, the bishop, and I'll dote her, Becky, and we'll have a wedding, Briggs. You shall make the breakfast, and be a bridesmaid." Briggs declared that it would be delightful, and vowed that her dear Miss Crawley was always kind and generous, and went up to Rebecca's room to console her and prattle about the offer, and the refusal, and the cause thereof, and to hint at the generous intentions of Miss Crawley, and to find out who was the gentleman that had the mastery of Miss Sharp's heart. Rebecca was very kind, very affectionate, and affected, responded to Briggs's offer of tenderness with grateful fervor, owned there was a secret attachment, a delicious mystery. What a pity Miss Briggs had not remained half a minute longer at the keyhole. Rebecca might, perhaps, have told more. But 5 minutes after Miss Briggs' arrival in Rebecca's apartment, Miss Crawley actually made her appearance there, an unheard-of honor. Her impatience had overcome her. She could not wait for the tardy operations of her ambassadress, so she came in person and ordered Briggs out of the room. And expressing her approval of Rebecca's conduct, she asked particulars of the interview and the previous transactions which had brought about the astonishing offer of Sir Pitt. Rebecca said she had long had some notion of the partiality with which Sir Pitt honored her, for he was in the habit of making his feelings known in a very frank and unreserved manner, but not to mention private reasons with which she would not for the present trouble Miss Crawley. Sir Pitt's age, station, and habits were such as to render a marriage quite impossible, and could a woman with any feeling of self-respect and any decency listen to proposals at such a moment when the funeral of the lover's deceased wife had not actually taken place? Nonsense, my dear. You would never have refused him had there not been someone else in the case, Miss Crawley said, coming to her point at once. Tell me the private reasons. What are the private reasons? There is someone. Who is it that has touched your heart? Rebecca cast down her eyes and owned there was. You have guessed right, dear lady, she said, with a sweet, simple, faltering voice. You wonder at one so poor and friendless having an attachment, don't you? I have never heard that poverty was any safeguard against it. I wish it were. My poor dear child, cried Miss Crawley, who was always quite ready to be sentimental. Is our passion unrequited, then? Are we pining in secret? Tell me all, and let me console you. I wish you could, dear madam, Rebecca said in a same tearful tone. Indeed, indeed, I need it. And she laid her head upon Miss Crawley's shoulder, and wept there so naturally that the old lady, surprised into sympathy, embraced her with an almost maternal kindness, uttered many soothing protests of regard and affection for her, vowed that she loved her as a daughter, and would do everything in her power to serve her. And now, who is it, my dear? Is it that pretty Miss Sedley's brother? You said something about an affair with him. I'll ask him here, my dear, and you shall have him. Indeed you shall. Don't ask me now, Rebecca said. You shall know all soon. Indeed you shall. Dear, kind Miss Crawley, dear friend, may I say so? That you may, my child, the old lady replied, kissing her. I can't tell you now, sobbed out Rebecca. I am so very miserable. But oh, love me always. Promise you will love me always. And in the midst of mutual tears, for the emotions of the younger woman had awakened the sympathies of the elder, this promise was solemnly given by Miss Crawley, who left her little protégée, blessing and admiring her as a dear, artless, tender-hearted, affectionate, incomprehensible creature. And now she was left alone to think over the sudden and wonderful events of the day, and of what had been and what might have been. What think you were the private feelings of begging her pardon, of Mrs. Rebecca? If, a few pages back, the present writer claimed the privilege of peeping into Miss Amelia Sedley's bedroom, and understanding the omniscience of the novelist, all the gentle pains and passions which were tossing upon that innocent pillow, why, should he not declare himself to be Rebecca's confidant too, master of her secrets, and seal-keeper of that young woman's conscience? Well then, in the first place, Rebecca gave way to some very sincere and touching regrets that a piece of marvelous good fortune should have been so near her, and she actually obliged to decline it. In this natural emotion, every properly regulated mind will certainly share. What good mother is there that would not commiserate a penniless spinster, who might have been my lady and have shared 4,000 a year? What well-bred young person is there in all Vanity Fair Who will not feel for a hard-working, ingenious, meritorious girl who gets such an honorable, advantageous, provoking offer, just at the very moment when it is out of her power to accept it? I am sure our friend Becky's disappointment deserves and will command every sympathy. I remember one night being in the fair myself at an evening party. I observed old Miss Toady there also present, single out for her special attentions and flattery little Miss Briefless, the barrister's wife, who is of a good family certainly, but, as we all know, is as poor can be. What, I asked in my own mind, can cause this obsequiousness on the part of Miss Toady? Has Briefless got a county court, or has his wife had a fortune left her? Miss Toady explained presently, with that simplicity which distinguishes all her conduct. You know, she said, Mrs. Briefless is granddaughter of Sir John Redhand, who is so ill at Cheltenham that he can't last 6 months. Mrs. Briefless's papa succeeds, so you see, she will be a baronet's daughter. And Toady asked Briefless and his wife to dinner the very next week. If the mere chance of becoming a baronet's daughter can procure a lady such homage in the world, surely we may respect the agonies of a young woman who has lost the opportunity of becoming a baronet's wife. Who would have dreamed of Lady Crawley dying so soon? She was one of those sickly women that might have lasted these 10 years. Rebecca thought to herself in all the woes of repentance, and I might have been my lady. I might have led that old man whither I would. I might have thanked Mrs. Bute for her patronage, and Mr. Pitt for his insufferable condescension. I would have had the town house newly furnished and decorated. I would have had the handsomest carriage in London, and a box at the opera. And I would have been presented next season. All this might have been. And now all was doubt and mystery. But Rebecca was a young lady of too much resolution and energy of character to permit herself much useless and unseemly sorrow for the irrevocable past. So, having devoted only the proper portion of regret to it, she wisely turned her whole attention towards the future, which was now vastly more important to her. And she surveyed her position and its hopes, doubts, and chances. In the first place, she was married. That was a great fact. Sir Pitt knew it. She was not so much surprised into the avowal as induced to make it by a sudden calculation. It must have come some day, and why not now as at a later period? He, who would have married her himself, must at least be silent with regard to her marriage. How Miss Crawley would bear the news was the great question. Misgivings Rebecca had, but she remembered all Miss Crawley said. The old lady's avowed contempt for birth, her daring liberal opinions, her general romantic propensities, her almost doting attachment to her nephew, and her repeatedly expressed fondness for Rebecca herself. She is so fond of him, Rebecca thought, that she will forgive him anything. She is so used to me that I don't think she could be comfortable without me. When the éclaircissement comes, there would be a scene, and hysterics, and a great quarrel, and then a great reconciliation. At all events, what use was there in delaying? The die was thrown, and now or tomorrow the issue must be the same. And so, resolved that Miss Crawley should have the news, the young person debated in her mind as to the best means of conveying it to her, and whether she should face the storm that must come, or fly and avoid it until its first fury was blown over. In this state of meditation, she wrote the following letter. Dearest friend, the great crisis, which we have debated about so often, is come. Half of my secret is known. I have thought and thought until I am quite sure that now is the time to reveal the whole of the mystery. Sir Pitt came to me this morning and made, what do you think? A declaration in form. Think of that. Poor little me, I might have been Lady Crawley. How pleased Mrs. Bute would have been, and ma tante, if I had taken precedence of her. I might have been somebody's mamma instead of... Oh, I tremble when I think how soon we must tell all. Sir Pitt knows I am married, and not knowing to whom, is not very much displeased as yet. Ma tante is actually angry that I should have refused him, but she is all kindness and graciousness. She condescends to say I would have made him a good wife, and vows that she will be a mother to your little Rebecca. She will be shaken when she first hears the news, but need we fear anything beyond a momentary anger? I think not. I am sure not. She dotes upon you so, you naughty good-for-nothing man, that she would pardon you anything. And indeed, I believe the next place in her heart is mine, and that she would be miserable without me. Dearest, something tells me we shall conquer. You shall leave that odious regiment, quit gaming, racing, and be a good boy, and we shall all live in Park Lane, and ma tante shall leave us all her money. I shall try and walk tomorrow at 3 in the usual place. If Miss B accompanies me, you must come to dinner and bring an answer, and put it in the 3rd volume of Porteus's sermons. But at all events, come to your own. R. To Miss Eliza Stiles, at Mr. Barnett's, Sadler, Knightsbridge. And I trust there is no reader of this little story who has not discernment enough to perceive that the Miss Eliza Stiles, an old schoolfellow, Rebecca said, with whom she had resumed an active correspondence of late, and who used to fetch these letters from the Sadlers, wore brass spurs and large curling mustachios, and was indeed no other than Captain Rawdon Crawley. Chapter 16. The Letter on the Pincushion. How they were married is not of the slightest consequence to anybody. What is it to hinder a captain, who is a major, and a young lady, who is of age, from purchasing a license and uniting themselves at any church in this town? Who needs be told that if a woman has a will, she will assuredly find a way? My belief is that one day, when Miss Sharp has gone to pass the forenoon with her dear friend, Miss Amelia Sedley, in Russell Square, a lady very like her might have been seen entering a church in the city, in company with a gentleman with dyed mustachios, who, after a quarter of an hour's interval, escorted her back to the hackney coach in waiting, and that this was a quiet bridal party. And who on earth, after the daily experience we have, can question the probability of a gentleman marrying anybody? How many of the wise and learned have married their cooks? Did not Lord Eldon himself, the most prudent of men, make a runaway match? Were not Achilles and Ajax both in love with their servant maids? And are we to expect a heavy dragoon, with strong desires and small brains, who had never controlled a passion in his life, to become prudent all of a sudden, and to refuse to pay any price for an indulgence to which he had a mind? If people only made prudent marriages, what a stop to population there would be! It seems to me, for my part, that Mr. Rawdon's marriage was one of the honestest actions which we shall have a record in any portion of that gentleman's biography which has to do with the present history. No one will say it is unmanly to be captivated by a woman, or, being captivated, to marry her. And the admiration, the delight, the passion, the wonder, the unbounded confidence and frantic adoration with which, by degrees, this big warrior got to regard the little Rebecca, were feelings which the ladies at least will pronounce were not altogether discreditable to him. When she sang, every note thrilled in his dull soul and tingled through his huge frame. When she spoke, she brought all the force of his brains to listen and wonder. If she was jocular, he used to revolve her jokes in his mind and explode over them half an hour afterwards in the street, to the surprise of the groom in the tilbury by his side, or the comrade riding with him in Rotten Row. Her words were oracles to him, her smallest actions marked by an infallible grace and wisdom. How she sings, how she paints, thought he. How she rode that kicking mare at Queen's Crawley. And he would say to her in confidential moments, "By Jove, Beck, you're fit to be Commander-in-Chief, or Archbishop of Canterbury. By Jove." Is his case a rare one? And don't we see every day in the world many an honest Hercules at the apron strings of Omphale, and great whiskered Samsons prostrate in Delilah's lap? Well, then, Becky told him that the great crisis was near, and the time for action had arrived. Rawdon expressed himself as ready to act under her orders as he would be to charge with his troop at the command of his colonel. There was no need for him to put his letter into the 3rd volume of Porteus. Rebecca easily found a means to get rid of Briggs, her companion, and met her faithful friend in the usual place on the next day. She had thought over matters at night and communicated to Rawdon the result of her determinations. He agreed, of course, to everything, was quite sure that it was all right, that what she proposed was best, that Miss Crawley would infallibly relent or come round, as he said, after a time. Had Rebecca's resolutions been entirely different, he would have followed them as implicitly. "You have had enough for both of us, Beck," said he. "You're sure to get us out of the scrape. I never saw your equal, and I've met with some clippers in my time, too." And with this simple confession of faith, the love-stricken dragoon left her to execute his part of the project which she had formed for the pair. It consisted simply in the hiring of quiet lodgings at Brompton, or in the neighborhood of the barracks, for Captain and Mrs. Crawley. For Rebecca had determined, and very prudently, we think, to fly. Rawdon was only too happy at her resolve. He had been entreating her to take this measure any time for weeks past. He pranced off to engage the lodgings with all the impetuosity of love. He agreed to pay 2 guineas a week so readily that the landlady regretted she had asked him so little. He ordered in a piano and half a nursery house full of flowers and a heap of good things. As for shawls, kid gloves, silk stockings, gold French watches, bracelets, and perfumery, he sent them in with the profusion of blind love and unbounded credit. And having relieved his mind by this outpouring of generosity, he went and dined nervously at the club, waiting until the great moment of his life should come. The occurrences of the previous day, the admirable conduct of Rebecca in refusing an offer so advantageous to her, the secret unhappiness preying upon her, the sweetness and silence with which she bore her affliction, made Miss Crawley much more tender than usual. An event of this nature, a marriage, or a refusal, or a proposal, thrills through a whole household of women, and sets all their hysterical sympathies at work. As an observer of human nature, I regularly frequent St. George's, Hanover Square, during the genteel marriage season, and though I have never seen the bridegroom's male friends give way to tears, or the beadles and officiating clergy any way affected, yet it is not at all uncommon to see women who are not in the least concerned in the operations going on, old ladies who are long past marrying, Stout, middle-aged females with plenty of sons and daughters, let alone pretty young creatures in pink bonnets who are on their promotion and may naturally take an interest in the ceremony. I say it is quite common to see the women present piping, sobbing, sniffling, hiding their little faces in their little useless pocket handkerchiefs, and heaving, old and young, with emotion. When my friend, the fashionable John Pimlico, married the lovely Lady Belgravia Green Parker, the excitement was so general that even the little snuffy old pew opener, who let me into the seat, was in tears. And wherefore? I inquired of my own soul. She was not going to be married. Miss Crawley and Briggs, in a word, after the affair of Sir Pitt, indulged in the utmost luxury of sentiment, and Rebecca became an object of the most tender interest to them. In her absence, Miss Crawley solaced herself with the most sentimental of the novels in her library. Little Sharp, with her secret griefs, was the heroine of the day. That night Rebecca sang more sweetly and talked more pleasantly than she ever had been heard to do in Park Lane. She twined herself round the heart of Miss Crawley. She spoke lightly and laughingly of Sir Pitt's proposal, ridiculed it as the foolish fancy of an old man, and her eyes filled with tears and Briggs's heart with unutterable pangs of defeat as she said she desired no other lot than to remain forever with her dear benefactress. "My dear little creature," the old lady said, "I don't intend to let you stir for years, that you may depend upon it. As for going back to that odious brother of mine after what has passed, it is out of the question. Here you stay with me and Briggs. Briggs wants to go to see her relations very often. Briggs, you may go when you like. But as for you, my dear, you must stay and take care of the old woman." If Rawdon Crawley had been then and there present, instead of being at the club nervously drinking claret, the pair might have gone down on their knees before the old spinster, avowed all, and been forgiven in a twinkling. But that good chance was denied to the young couple, doubtless in order that this story might be written, in which numbers of their wonderful adventures are narrated. Adventures which could never have occurred to them if they had been housed and sheltered under the comfortable, uninteresting forgiveness of Miss Crawley. Under Mrs. Firkin's orders, in the Park Lane establishment, was a young woman from Hampshire, whose business it was, among other duties, to knock at Miss Sharp's door with that jug of hot water which Firkin would rather have perished than have presented to the intruder. This girl, bred on the family estate, had a brother in Captain Crawley's troop, and if the truth were known, I dare say it would come out that she was aware of certain arrangements which have a great deal to do with this history. At any rate, she purchased a yellow shawl, a pair of green boots, and a light blue hat with a red feather, with 3 guineas which Rebecca gave her. And as Little Sharp was by no means too liberal with her money, no doubt it was for services rendered that Betty Martin was so bribed. On the second day after Sir Pitt Crawley's offer, to Miss Sharp, the sun rose as usual, and at the usual hour Betty Martin, the upstairs maid, knocked at the door of the governess's bedchamber. No answer was returned, and she knocked again. Silence was still uninterrupted, and Betty, with the hot water, opened the door and entered the chamber. The little white dimity bed was as smooth and trim as on the day previous, when Betty's own hands had helped to make it. 2 little trunks were corded in one end of the room, and on the table before the window, on the pincushion, the great fat pincushion lined with pink inside and twilled like a lady's nightcap, lay a letter. It had been reposing there probably all night. Betty advanced towards it on tiptoe, as if she were afraid to wake it, looked at it and round the room with an air of great wonder and satisfaction, took up the letter, and grinned intensely as she turned it round and over, and finally carried it into Miss Briggs' room below. How could Betty tell that the letter was for Miss Briggs, I should like to know? All the schooling Betty had had was at Mrs. Bute Crawley's Sunday school, and she could no more read writing than Hebrew. "La, Miss Briggs!" the girl exclaimed. "Oh, miss, something must have happened. There's nobody in Miss Sharp's room. The bed ain't been slep in, and she's run away and left this letter for you, miss." "What?" cries Briggs, dropping her comb, the thin wisp of faded hair falling over her shoulders. "An elopement! Miss Sharp, a fugitive? What? What is this?" And she eagerly broke the neat seal, and as they say, devoured the contents of the letter addressed to her. "Dear Miss Briggs," the refugee wrote, "the kindest heart in the world, as yours is, will pity and sympathize with me and excuse me. With tears and prayers and blessings, I leave the home where the poor orphan has ever met with kindness and affection. Claims even superior to those of my benefactress call me hence. I go to my duty, to my husband. Yes, I am married. My husband commands me to seek the humble home which we call ours. Dearest Miss Briggs, break the news, as your delicate sympathy will know how to do it. To my dear, my beloved friend and benefactress. Tell her, ere I went, I shed tears on her dear pillow, that pillow that I have so often soothed in sickness, that I long again to watch. Oh, with what joy shall I return to Deer Park Lane? How I tremble for the answer which is to seal my fate, when Sir Pitt deigned to offer me his hand, an honor of which my beloved Miss Crawley said I was deserving. My blessings go with her for judging the poor orphan worthy to be her sister. I told Sir Pitt that I was already a wife. Even he forgave me, but my courage failed me when I should have told him all, that I could not be his wife, for I was his daughter. I am wedded to the best and most generous of men. Miss Crawley's Rawdon is my Rawdon. At his command I open my lips and follow him, our humble home, as I would through the world. Oh, my excellent and kind friend, intercede with my Rawdon's beloved aunt for him, and the poor girl to whom his noble race should have shown such unparalleled affection. Ask Miss Crawley to receive her children. I can say no more, but blessings, blessings on all in the dear house I leave. Praise your affectionate and grateful Rebecca Crawley. Midnight. Just as Briggs had finished reading this affecting and interesting document, which reinstated her in her position as first confidant of Miss Crawley, Mrs. Firkin entered the room. "Here's Mrs. Bute Crawley, just arrived by the mail from Hampshire, and wants some tea. Will you come down and make breakfast, miss?" And to the surprise of Firkin, clasping her dressing gown round her, the wisp of hair floating disheveled behind her, the little curl papers still sticking in bunches round her forehead, Briggs sailed down to Mrs. Bute with the letter in her hand containing the wonderful news. "Oh, Mrs. Firkin," gasped Betty, "sich a business. Miss Sharp have a gone and run away with the captain, and they're off to Gretny Green." We would devote a chapter to describe the emotions of Mrs. Firkin, did not the passions of her mistresses occupy our genteeler muse. When Mrs. Bute Crawley, numbed with midnight traveling and warming herself at the newly crackling parlor fire, heard Miss Briggs the intelligence of the clandestine marriage, she declared it was quite providential that she should have arrived at such a time to assist poor dear Miss Crawley in supporting the shock, that Rebecca was an artful little hussy, of whom she had always had her suspicions, and that as for Rawdon Crawley, she never could account for his aunt's infatuation regarding him, and had long considered him a profligate, lost, and abandoned being. And this awful conduct, Mrs. Bute said, will have at least this good effect. It will open poor dear Miss Crawley's eyes to the real character of this wicked man. Then Mrs. Butte had a comfortable hot toast and tea, and as there was a vacant room in the house now, there was no need for her to remain at the Gloucester Coffee House, where the Portsmouth mail had set her down, and whence she ordered Mr. Bowles' aide-de-camp, the footman, to bring away her trunks. Miss Crawley, be it known, did not leave her room until near noon, taking chocolate in bed in the morning while Becky Sharp read the Morning Post to her, or otherwise amusing herself or dawdling. The conspirators below agreed that they would spare the dear lady's feelings until she appeared in her drawing room. Meanwhile, it was announced to her that Mrs. Butte Crawley had come up from Hampshire by the mail, was staying at the Gloucester, sent her love to Miss Crawley, and asked for breakfast with Miss Briggs. The arrival of Mrs. Butte, which would not have caused any extreme delight at another period, was hailed with pleasure now. Miss Crawley, being pleased at the notion of a gossip with her sister-in-law regarding the late Lady Crawley, the funeral arrangements pending, and Sir Pitt's abrupt proposal to Rebecca. It was not until the old lady was fairly ensconced in her usual armchair in the drawing-room, and the preliminary embraces and inquiries had taken place between the ladies, that the conspirators thought it advisable to submit her to the operation. Who has not admired the artifices and delicate approaches with which women prepare their friends for bad news? Miss Crawley's two friends made such an apparatus of mystery before they broke the intelligence to her, that they worked her up to a necessary degree of doubt and alarm. And she refused Sir Pitt. "My dear, dear Miss Crawley, prepare yourself for it," Mrs. Butte said, because she couldn't help herself. "Of course there was a reason," Miss Crawley answered. "She likes somebody else. I told Briggs so yesterday." "Likes somebody else?" Briggs gasped. "Oh, my dear friend, she's married already." "Married already," Mrs. Butte chimed in, and both sate with clasped hands looking from each other at their victim. "Send her to me, the instant she comes in, the little sly wretch. How dared she not tell me?" cried out Miss Crawley. "She won't come in soon. Prepare yourself, dear friend. She's gone out for a long time. She's gone altogether." "Gracious goodness, and who's to make my chocolate? Send for her and have her back. I desire that she come back," the old lady said. "She decamped last night, ma'am," cried Mrs. Butte. "She left a letter for me," Briggs exclaimed. "She's married to—" "Prepare her! For heaven's sake, don't torture her, my dear Miss Briggs." "She's married to whom?" cries the spinster in a nervous fury. To a relation of—" "She refused Sir Pitt," cried the victim. "Speak at once. Don't drive me mad." "Oh, ma'am, prepare her, Miss Briggs. She's married to Rawdon Crawley." "Rawdon married Rebecca? Governess? Nobody— Get out of my house, you fool, you idiot, you stupid old Briggs. How dare you? You're in the plot. You made him marry, thinking that I'd leave my money from him. You did, Martha." The poor old lady screamed in hysteric sentences. "I, ma'am, ask a member of this family to marry a drawing-master's daughter." "Her mother was a Montmorency," cried out the old lady, pulling at the bell with all her might. "Her mother was an opera girl, and she has been on the stage or worse herself," said Mrs. Butte. Miss Crawley gave a final scream and fell back in a faint. They were forced to take her back to the room which she had just quitted. One fit of hysterics succeeded another. The doctor was sent for, the apothecary arrived. Mrs. Butte took up the post of nurse by her bedside. Her relations ought to be round her, that amiable woman said. She had scarcely been carried up to her room when a new person arrived to whom it was also necessary to break the news. This was Sir Pitt. "Where's Becky?" he said, coming in. "Where's her traps? She's coming with me to Queen's Crawley." "Have you not heard the astonishing intelligence regarding her surreptitious union?" Briggs asked. What's that to me? Sir Pitt asked. I know she's married. That makes no odds. Tell her to come down at once and not keep me. Are you not aware, sir, Miss Briggs asked, that she has left our roof to the dismay of Miss Crawley, who was nearly killed by the intelligence of Captain Rawdon's union with her? When Sir Pitt Crawley heard that Rebecca was married to his son, he broke out into a fury of language, which it would do no good to repeat in this place, as indeed it sent poor Briggs shuddering out of the room. And with her, we will shut the door upon the figure of the frenzied old man, wild with hatred and insane with baffled desire. One day after he went to Queen's Crawley, he burst like a madman into the room she had used when there, dashed open her boxes with his foot, and flung about her papers, clothes, and other relics. Miss Horrocks, the butler's daughter, took some of them. The children dressed themselves and acted plays in the others. It was but a few days after the poor mother had gone to her lonely burying place, and was laid, unwept and disregarded, in a vault full of strangers. Suppose the old lady doesn't come too, Rawdon said to his little wife as they sate together in the snug little Brompton lodgings. She had been trying the new piano all the morning. The new gloves fitted her to a nicety. The new shawls became her wonderfully. The new rings glittered on her little hands, and the new watch ticked at her waist. Suppose she don't come round, eh, Becky? I'll make your fortune, she said, and Delilah patted Samson's cheek. You can do anything, he said, kissing the little hand. By Jove, you can. And we'll drive down to the Star and Garter and dine, by Jove. Chapter 17. How Captain Dauben Bought a Piano. If there is any exhibition in all Vanity Fair which satire and sentiment can visit arm in arm together, where you light on the strangest contrasts laughable and tearful, where you may be gentle and pathetic, or savage and cynical with perfect propriety, it is at one of those public assemblies, a crowd of which are advertised every day in the last page of the Times newspaper, and over which the late Mr. George Robins used to preside with so much dignity. There are very few London people, as I fancy, who have not attended at these meetings, and all with a taste for moralizing must have thought, with a sensation and interest not a little startling and queer, of the day when their turn shall come too, and Mr. Hammerdowne will sell by the orders of Diogenes' assignees, or will be instructed by the executors to offer to public competition the library, furniture, plate, wardrobe, and choice cellar of wines of Epicurus deceased. Even with the most selfish disposition, the Vanity Fairian, as he witnesses this sordid part of the obsequious of a departed friend, can't but feel some sympathies and regret. My Lord Dives's remains are in the family vault. The statuaries are cutting an inscription veraciously commemorating his virtues and the sorrows of his heir, who is disposing of his goods. What guest at Dives's table can pass the familiar house without a sigh? The familiar house of which the lights used to shine so cheerfully at 7 o'clock, of which the hall doors opened so readily, of which the obsequious servants, as you passed up the comfortable stair, sounded your name from landing to landing until it reached the apartment where jolly old Dives welcomed his friends. What a number of them he had, and what a noble way of entertaining them! How witty people used to be here, who were morose when they got out of the door, and how courteous and friendly men who slandered and hated each other everywhere else. He was pompous, but with such a cook, what would one not swallow? He was rather dull, perhaps, but would not such wine make any conversation pleasant? We must get some of his Burgundy at any price, the mourners cry at his club. I got this box at old Dives's sale, Pincher says, handing it round. One of Louis XV's mistresses. Pretty thing, is it not? Sweet miniature. And they talk of the way in which young Dives is dissipating his fortune. How changed the house is, though. The front is patched over with bills, setting forth the particulars of the furniture in staring capitals. They have hung a shred of carpet out of an upstairs window. A half dozen of porters are lounging on the dirty steps. The hall swarms with dingy guests of oriental continents who thrust printed cards into your hand and offer to bid. Old women and amateurs have invaded the upper apartments, pinching the bed curtains, poking into the feathers, shampooing the mattresses, and clapping the wardrobe drawers to and fro. Enterprising young housekeepers are measuring the looking-glass and hangings to see if they will suit the new menage. Snob will brag for years that he has purchased this or that at Dives's sale. And Mr. Hammerdown is sitting on the great mahogany dining tables in the dining room below, waving the ivory hammer, and employing all the artifices of eloquence, enthusiasm, entreaty, reason, despair, shouting to his people, satirizing Mr. Davids for his sluggishness, inspiriting Mr. Moss into action, imploring, commanding, bellowing, until down comes the hammer like fate and we pass to the next lot. Oh, Dives, who would ever have thought, as we sat round the broad table, sparkling with plate and spotless linen, to have seen such a dish at the head of it as that roaring auctioneer? It was rather late in the sale. The excellent drawing-room furniture by the best makers, the rare and famous wines selected, regardless of cost, and with the well-known taste of the purchaser. The rich and complete set of family plate had been sold on the previous days. Certain of the best wines, which all had a great character among amateurs in the neighborhood, had been purchased for his master, who knew them very well, by the butler of our friend, John Osborne, Esquire of Russell Square. A small portion of the most useful articles of the plate had been bought by some young stockbrokers from the city, and now, the public being invited to the purchase of minor objects, it happened that the orator on the table was expatiating on the merits of a picture, which he sought to recommend to his audience. It was by no means so select or numerous a company as had attended the previous days of the auction. "Number 369, roared Mr. Hammerdown. "Portrait of a gentleman on an elephant. Who'll bid for the gentleman on the elephant? Lift up the picture, Blowman, and let the company examine this lot." A long, pale, military-looking gentleman, seated demurely at the mahogany table, could not help grinning as this valuable lot was shown by Mr. Blowman. "Turn the elephant to the captain, Blowman. What shall we say, sir, for the elephant?" But the captain, blushing in a very hurried and discomfited manner, turned away his head. "Shall we say 20 guineas for this work of art? 15, 5, name your own price. The gentleman without the elephant is worth £5. "I wonder it ain't come down with him," said a professional wag. "He's anyhow a precious big one." At which, for the elephant rider was represented as of a very stout figure, there was a general giggle in the room. "Don't be trying to deprecate the value of the lot, Mr. Moss," Mr. Hammerdown said. "Let the company examine it as a work of art. The attitude of the gallant animal quite according to nature. The gentleman in a nankeen jacket, his gun in his hand, is going to the chase. In the distance, a banyan tree and a pagody, most likely resemblances of some interesting sport in our famous eastern possessions. How much for this lot? Come, gentlemen, don't keep me here all day." Someone bid 5 shillings, at which the military gentleman looked towards the quarter from which this splendid offer had come, and there saw another officer with a young lady on his arm, who both appeared to be highly amused with the scene, and to whom, finally, this lot was knocked down for half a guinea. He at the table looked more surprised and discomposed than ever when he spied this pair, and his head sank into his military collar, and he turned his back upon them so as to avoid them altogether. Of all the other articles which Mr. Hamerdown had the honor to offer for public competition that day, is not our purpose to make mention, save of one only, a little square piano, which came down from the upper regions of the house, the state grand piano having been disposed of previously. This the young lady tried with a rapid and skillful hand, making the officer blush and start again. And for it, when its turn came, her agent began to bid. There was an opposition here. The Hebrew aide-de-camp in the service of the officer at the table bid against the Hebrew gentleman employed by the elephant purchasers, and a brisk battle ensued over this little piano, the combatants being greatly encouraged by Mr. Hamerdown. At last, when the competition had been prolonged for some time, the elephant captain and lady desisted from the race, and the hammer coming down, the auctioneer said, "Mr. Lewis, 25, and Mr. Lewis's chief thus became the proprietor of the little square piano. Having effected the purchase, he sate up as if he was greatly relieved, and the unsuccessful competitors, catching a glimpse of him at this moment, the lady said to her friend, "Why, Rawdon, it's Captain Dauben." I suppose Becky was discontented with the new piano her husband had hired for her, or perhaps the proprietors of that instrument had fetched it away, declining farther credit, or perhaps she had a particular attachment for the one which she had just tried to purchase, recollecting it in old days when she used to play upon it in the little sitting room of our dear Amelia Sedley. The sale was at the old house in Russell Square, where we passed some evenings together at the beginning of this story. Good old John Sedley was a ruined man. His name had been proclaimed as a defaulter on the stock exchange, and his bankruptcy and commercial extermination had followed. Mr. Osborne's butler came to buy some of the famous port wine to transfer to the cellars over the way. As for 12 well-manufactured silver spoons and forks at per ounce, and 12 desert ditto, there were 3 young stockbrokers, Messrs. Dale, Spigot, and Dale, of Threadneedle Street, indeed, who, having had dealings with the old man, and kindnesses from him in days when he was kind to everybody with whom he dealt, sent this little spar out of the wreck with their love to good Mrs. Sedley, and with respect to the piano, as it had been Amelia's, and as she might miss it and want one now, and as Captain William Dauben could no more play upon it than he could dance on the tightrope, it is probable that he did not purchase the instrument for his own use. In a word, it arrived that evening at a wonderful small cottage in a street leading from the Fulham Road, one of those streets which have the finest romantic names. This was called St. Adelaide Villas, Anna Maria Road West, where the houses look like baby houses, where the people, looking out of the first-floor windows, must infallibly, as you think, sit with their feet in the parlors, where the shrubs in the little gardens in front bloom with a perennial display of little children's pinafores, little red socks, caps, etc., polyandria, polygnia, whence you hear the sound of jingling spinets and women singing, where little porter pots hang on the railings sunning themselves, whither of evenings you see city clerks padding wearily. Here it was that Mr. Clapp, the clerk of Mr. Sedley, had his domicile, and in this asylum the good old gentleman hid his head with his wife and daughter when the crash came. Joe Sedley had acted as a man of his disposition would when the announcement of the family misfortune reached him. He did not come to London, but he wrote to his mother to draw upon his agents for whatever money was wanted, so that his kind, broken-spirited old parents had no present poverty to fear. This done, Jos went on at the boarding house at Cheltenham pretty much as before. He drove his curricle, He drank his claret, he played his rubber. He told his Indian stories, and the Irish widow consoled and flattered him as usual. His present of money, needful as it was, made little impression on his parents, and I have heard Amelia say that the first day on which she saw her father lift up his head after the failure was on the receipt of the packet of forks and spoons with the young stockbroker's love, over which he burst out crying like a child, being greatly more affected than even his wife, to whom the present was addressed. Edward Dale, the junior of the house, who purchased the spoons for the firm, was, in fact, very sweet upon Amelia, and offered for her in spite of all. He married Miss Louisa Cutts, daughter of Higham and Cutts, the eminent corn factors, with a handsome fortune in 1820, and is now living in splendor with a numerous family and his elegant villa, Muswell Hill. But we must not let the recollections of this good fellow cause us to diverge from the principal history. I hope the reader has much too good an opinion of Captain and Mrs. Crawley to suppose that they ever would have dreamed of paying a visit to so remote a district as Bloomsbury, if they thought the family whom they proposed to honor with a visit were not merely out of fashion, but out of money, and could be serviceable to them in no possible manner. Rebecca was entirely surprised at the sight of the comfortable old house, where she had met with no small kindness, ransacked by brokers and bargainers, and its quiet family treasures given up to public desecration and plunder. A month after her flight, she had bethought her of Amelia, and Rawdon, with a hoarse laugh, had expressed a perfect willingness to see young George Osborne again. "He's a very agreeable acquaintance, Beck," the wag added. "I'd like to sell him another horse, Beck. I'd like to play a few more games at billiards with him. He'd be what I call useful just now. Mrs. C." By which sort of speech it is not to be supposed that Rawdon Crawley had a deliberate desire to cheat Mr. Osborne at play, but only wished to take that fair advantage of him which almost every sporting gentleman in Vanity Fair considers to be his due from his neighbor. The old aunt was long in coming to. A month had elapsed. Rawdon was denied the door by Mr. Bowles. His servants could not get a lodgment in the house at Park Lane. His letters were sent back unopened. Miss Crawley never stirred out. She was unwell, and Mrs. Bute remained still and never left her. Crawley and his wife, both of them, augured evil from the continued presence of Mrs. Bute. "Gad, I begin to perceive now why she was always bringing us together at Queen's Crawley," Rawdon said. "What an artful little woman," ejaculated Rebecca. "Well, I don't regret it if you don't," the captain cried, still in an amorous rapture with his wife, who rewarded him with a kiss by way of reply, and was indeed not a little gratified by the generous confidence of her husband. "If he had but a little more brains," she thought to herself, "I might make something of him." But she never let him perceive the opinion she had of him, listened with indefatigable complacency to his stories of the stable and the mess, laughed at all his jokes, felt the greatest interest in Jack Spatterdash, whose cab horse had come down, and Bob Martingale, who had been taken up in a gambling house with Tom Cinquebars, who was going to ride the steeplechase. When he came home, she was alert and happy. When he went out, she pressed him to go. When he stayed at home, she played and sang for him, made him good drinks, superintended his dinner, warmed his slippers, and steeped his soul in comfort. The best of women, I have heard my grandmother say, are hypocrites. We don't know how much they hide from us, how watchful they are when they seem most artless and confidential, how often those frank smiles which they wear so easily are traps to cajole or elude or disarm. I don't mean in your mere coquettes, but your domestic models and paragons of female virtue. Who has not seen a woman hide the dullness of a stupid husband, or coax the fury of a savage one? We accept this amiable slavishness and praise a woman for it. We call this pretty treachery truth. A good housewife is of necessity a humbug, and Cornelia's husband was hoodwinked, as Potiphar was, only in a different way. By these attentions, that veteran rake, Rawdon Crawley, found himself converted into a very happy and submissive married man. His former haunts knew him not. They asked about him once or twice at his clubs, but did not miss him much. In those booths of Vanity Fair, people seldom do miss each other. His secluded wife ever smiling and cheerful, his little comfortable lodgings, snug meals, and homely evenings had all the charms of novelty and secrecy. The marriage was not yet declared to the world or published in the Morning Post. All his creditors would have come rushing on him in a body had they known that he was united to a woman without fortune. "My relations won't cry fee upon me," Becky said with rather a bitter laugh, and she was quite contented to wait until the old aunt should be reconciled before she claimed her place in society. So she lived at Brompton, and meanwhile saw no one, or only those few of her husband's male companions who were admitted into her little dining room. These were all charmed with her. The little dinners, the laughing and chatting, the music afterwards, delighted all who participated in these enjoyments. Major Martingale never thought about asking to see the marriage license. Captain Cinquebars was perfectly enchanted with her skill in making punch. And young Lieutenant Spatterdash, who was fond of piquet, and whom Crawley would often invite, was evidently and quickly smitten by Mrs. Crawley. But her own circumspection and modesty never forsook her for a moment, and Crawley's reputation as a fire-eating and jealous warrior was a further and complete defense to his little wife. There are gentlemen of very good blood and fashion in this city who never have entered a lady's drawing-room, so that though Rawdon Crawley's marriage might be talked about in his county, where, of course, Mrs. Bute had spread the news, in London it was doubted, or not heeded, or not talked about at all. He lived comfortably on credit. He had a large capital of debts, which, laid out judiciously, will carry a man along for many, many years, and on which certain men about town contrive to live 100 times better than even men with ready money can do. Indeed, who is there that walks London streets but can point out half a dozen men riding by him splendidly, while he is on foot, courted by fashion, bowed into their carriages by tradesmen, denying themselves nothing and living on who knows what? We see Jack Thriftless prancing in the park or darting in his brougham down Pall Mall. We eat his dinners served on his miraculous plate. How did this begin, we say, or where will it end? "My dear fellow," I heard Jack once say, "I owe money in every capital in Europe. The end must come some day, but in the meantime Jack thrives as much as ever. People are glad enough to shake him by the hand, ignore the little dark stories that are whispered every now and then against him, and pronounce him a good-natured, jovial, reckless fellow." Truth obliges us to confess that Rebecca had married a gentleman of this order. Everything was plentiful in his house but ready money, of which their menage pretty early felt the want, and reading the Gazette one day, and coming upon the announcement of Lieutenant J. Osborne to be captain by purchase, Vice Smith, who exchanges, Rawdon uttered that sentiment regarding Amelia's lover which ended in the visit to Russell Square. When Rawdon and his wife wished to communicate with Captain Dauben at the sale, and to know particulars of the catastrophe which had befallen Rebecca's old acquaintances, the captain had vanished, and such information as they got was from a stray porter or broker at the auction. "Look at them with their hooked beaks," Becky said, getting into the buggy, her picture under her arm in great glee. "They're like vultures after a battle." "Don't know. Never was in action, my dear. Ask Martingale. He was in Spade, aide-de-camp to General Blazes. He was a very kind old man, Mr. Sedley, Rebecca said. I'm really sorry he's gone wrong. Oh, stockbrokers, bankrupts, used to it, you know? Rawdon replied, cutting a fly off the horse's ear. I wish we could have afforded some of the plate, Rawdon, the wife continued sentimentally. 25 guineas was monstrously dear for that little piano. We chose it at Broadwood's for Amelia when she came from school. It only cost 35 then. What do you call him? Osborne. Will cry off now, I suppose, since the family is smashed. How cut up your pretty little friend will be, hey, Becky? I dare say she'll recover it, Becky said with a smile, and they drove on and talked about something else. Chapter 18. Who played on the piano Captain Dauben bought? Our surprise story now finds itself for a moment among very famous events and personages, and hanging on to the skirts of history. When the eagles of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican upstart, were flying from Provence, where they had perched after a brief sojourn in Elba, and from steeple to steeple until they reached the towers of Notre Dame, I wonder whether the imperial birds had any eye for a little corner of the parish of Bloomsbury, London, which you might have thought so quiet that even the whirring and flapping of those mighty wings would pass unobserved there. Napoleon has landed at Cannes. Such news might create a panic at Vienna and cause Russia to drop his cards and take Prussia into a corner, and Talleyrand and Metternich to wag their heads together, while Prince Hardenberg and even the present Marquis of Londonderry were puzzled. But how was this intelligence to affect a young lady in Russell Square, before whose door the watchman sang the hours when she was asleep, who, if she strolled in the square, was guarded there by the railings and the beadle, who, if she walked ever so short a distance to buy a ribbon in Southampton Row, was followed by Black Sambo with an enormous cane, who always cared for, dressed, put to bed, and watched over by ever so many guardian angels, with and without wages. Bon Dieu, I say, is it not hard that the fateful rush of the great imperial struggle can't take place without affecting a poor little harmless girl of 18, who is occupied in billing and cooing or working muslin collars in Russell Square? You too, kindly, homely flower, is the great roaring war tempest coming to sweep you down here, although cowering under the shelter of Holborn? Yes, Napoleon is flinging his last stake, and poor little Emmy Sedley's happiness forms, somehow, part of it. In the first place, her father's fortune was swept down with that fatal news. All his speculations had of late gone wrong with the luckless old gentleman. Ventures had failed, merchants had broken, funds had risen when he calculated they would fall. What need to particularize? If success is rare and slow, everybody knows how quick and easy ruin is. Old Sedley had kept his own sad counsel. Everything seemed to go on as usual in the quiet, opulent house. The good-natured mistress pursuing, quite unsuspiciously, her bustling idleness and daily easy avocations. The daughter absorbed still in one selfish, tender thought, and quite regardless of all the world besides, when that final crash came, under which the worthy family fell. One night Mrs. Sedley was writing cards for a party. The Osbornes had given one, and she must not be behindhand. John Sedley, who had come home very late from the city, sat silent at the chimney side, while his wife was prattling to him. Emmy had gone up to her room ailing and low-spirited. She's not happy, the mother went on. George Osborne neglects her. I've no patience with the airs of those people. The girls have not been in the house these 3 weeks, and George has been twice in town without coming. Edward Dale saw him at the opera. Edward would marry her, I'm sure, and there's Captain Dauben, who, I think, would. Only I hate all army men. Such a dandy as George has become, with his military airs indeed. We must show some folks that we're as good as they. Only give Edward Dale any encouragement, and you'll see. We must have a party. Mr. S., why don't you speak? John? Shall I say Tuesday, fortnight? Oh, why don't you answer? Good God, John, what has happened? John Sedley sprang up out of his chair to meet his wife, who ran to him. He seized her in his arms and said with a hasty voice, We're ruined, Mary. We've got the world to begin over again, dear. It's best that you should know all, and at once. As he spoke, he trembled in every limb and almost fell. He thought the news would have overpowered his wife to whom he had never said a hard word. But it was he that was the most moved, sudden as the shock was to her. When he sank back into his seat, it was the wife that took the office of consoler. She took his trembling hand and kissed it and put it round her neck. She called him her John, her dear John, her old man, her kind old man. She poured out 100 words of incoherent love and tenderness. Her faithful voice and simple caresses wrought this sad heart up to an inexpressible delight and anguish, and cheered and solaced over his overburdened soul. Only once in the course of the long night as they sate together, and poor Sedley opened his pent-up soul and told the story of his losses and embarrassments, the treason of some of his oldest friends, the manly kindness of some from whom he never could have expected it. In a general confession, only once did the faithful wife give way to emotion. My God, it will break Emmy's heart," she said. The father had forgotten the poor girl. She was lying awake and unhappy overhead. In the midst of friends, home, and kind parents, she was alone. To how many people can anyone tell all? Who will be open where there is no sympathy, or has call to speak to those who never can understand? Our gentle Amelia was thus solitary. She had no confidant, so to speak, ever since she had anything to confide. She could not tell the old mother her cares and doubts. The would-be sisters seemed every day more strange to her, and she had misgivings and fears which she dared not acknowledge to herself, though she was always secretly brooding over them. Her heart tried to persist in asserting that George Osborne was worthy and faithful to her, though she knew otherwise. How many a thing had she said and got no echo from him? How many suspicions of selfishness and indifference had she to encounter and obstinately overcome? To whom could the poor little martyr tell these daily struggles and tortures? Her hero himself only half understood her. She did not dare to own that the man she loved was her inferior, or to feel that she had given her heart away too soon. Given once, the poor, bashful maiden was too modest, too tender, too trustful, too weak, too much woman to recall it. We are Turks with the affections of our women, and have made them subscribe to our doctrine too. We let their bodies go abroad liberally enough, with smiles and ringlets and pink bonnets to disguise them, instead of veils and yakmaks. But their souls must be seen only by one man, and they obey not unwillingly, and consent to remain at home as our slaves, ministering to us and doing drudgery for us. So imprisoned and tortured was this gentle little heart, when in the month of March, Anno Domini in 1815, Napoleon landed at Cannes, and Louis XVIII fled, and all Europe was in alarm, and the funds fell, and old John Sedley was ruined. We are not going to follow the worthy old stockbroker through those last pangs and agonies of ruin through which he passed before his commercial demise befell. They declared him at the stock exchange. He was absent from his house of business. His bills were protested. his act of bankruptcy formal. The house and furniture of Russell Square were seized and sold up, and he and his family were thrust away, as we have seen, to hide their heads where they might. John Sedley had not the heart to review the domestic establishment who have appeared now and anon in our pages, and of whom he was now forced by poverty to take leave. The wages of those worthy people were discharged with that punctuality which men frequently show who only owe in great sums. They were sorry to leave good places, but they did not break their hearts at parting from their adored master and mistress. Amelia's maid was profuse in condolences, but went off quite resigned to better herself in a genteeler quarter of town. Black Sambo, with the infatuation of his profession, determined on setting up a public house. Honest old Mrs. Blankensop, indeed, who had seen the birth of Jos and Amelia, and the wooing of John Sedley and his wife, was for staying by them without wages, having amassed a considerable sum in their service, and she accompanied the fallen people into their new and humble place of refuge, where she tended them and grumbled against them for a while. Of all Sedley's opponents in his debates with his creditors which now ensued, and harassed the feelings of the humiliated old gentleman so severely, that in 6 weeks he oldened more than he had done for 15 years before. The most determined and obstinate seemed to be John Osborne, his old friend and neighbor. John Osborne, whom he had set up in life, who was under 100 obligations to him, and whose son was to marry Sedley's daughter. Any one of these circumstances would account for the bitterness of Osborne's opposition. When one man has been under very remarkable obligations to another, with whom he subsequently quarrels, a common sense of decency, as it were, makes of the former a much severer enemy than a mere stranger would be. To account for your own hard-heartedness and ingratitude in such a case, you are bound to prove the other party's crime. It is not that you are selfish, brutal, and angry at the failure of a speculation. No, no. It is that your partner has led you into it by the basest treachery and with the most sinister motives. From a mere sense of consistency, a persecutor is bound to show that the fallen man is a villain. Otherwise he, the persecutor, is a wretch himself. And as a general rule, you may make all creditors who are inclined to be severe pretty comfortable in their minds. No men embarrassed are altogether honest, very likely. They conceal something. They exaggerate chances of good luck, hide away the real state of affairs, say things are flourishing when they are hopeless, keep a smiling face, a dreary smile it is, upon the verge of bankruptcy, are ready to lay hold of any pretext for delay or of any money, so as to stave off the inevitable ruin a few days longer. Down with such dishonesty, says the creditor in triumph, and reviles his sinking enemy. You fool! Why do you catch at a straw? Calm, good sense says to the man that is drowning, You villain! Why do you shrink from plunging into the irretrievable gazette? Says prosperity to the poor devil battling in that black gulf. Who has not remarked the readiness with which the closest of friends and the honestest of men suspect and accuse each other of cheating when they fall out on money matters? Everybody does it. Everybody is right, I suppose, and the world is a rogue. Then Osborne had the intolerable sense of former benefits to goad and irritate him. These are always a cause of hostility aggravated. Finally, he had to break off the match between Sedley's daughter and his son, and as it had gone very far indeed, and as the poor girl's happiness and perhaps true character were compromised, it was necessary to show the strongest reasons for the rupture, and for John Osborne to prove John Sedley to be a very bad character indeed. At the meetings of creditors, then, he comported himself with a savageness and scorn towards Sedley, which almost succeeded in breaking the heart of that ruined, bankrupt man. On George's intercourse with Amelia, he put an instant veto, menacing the youth with maledictions if he broke his commands, and vilipending the poor innocent girl as the basest and most artful of vixens. One of the great conditions of anger and hatred is that you must tell and believe lies against the hated object, in order, as we said, to be consistent. When the great crash came, the announcement of ruin and the departure from Russell Square, and the declaration that all was over between her and George, all over between her and love, her and happiness, her and faith in the world. A brutal letter from John Osborne told her, in a few curt lines, that her father's conduct had been of such a nature that all engagements between the families were at an end. When the final award came, it did not shock her so much as her parents, as her mother rather expected, for John Sedley himself was entirely prostrate in the ruins of his own affairs and shattered honor. Amelia took the news very palely and calmly. It was only the confirmation of the dark presages which had long gone before. It was the mere reading of the sentence, of the crime she had long ago been guilty, the crime of loving wrongly, too violently, against reason. She told no more of her thoughts now than she had before. She seemed scarcely more unhappy now when convinced all hope was over, than before when she felt but dared not confess that it was gone. So she changed from the large house to the small one without any mark or difference, remained in her little room for the most part, pined silently, and died away day by day. I do not mean to say that all females are so. My dear Miss Bullock, I do not think your heart would break in this way. You are a strong-minded young woman with proper principles. I do not venture to say that mine would. It has suffered, and, it must be confessed, survived. But there are some souls thus gently constituted, thus frail and delicate and tender. Whenever old John Sedley thought of the affair between George and Amelia, or alluded to it, it was with bitterness almost as great as Mr. Osborne himself had shown. He cursed Osborne and his family as heartless, wicked, and ungrateful. No power on earth, he swore, would induce him to marry his daughter to the son of such a villain, and he ordered Emmy to banish George from her mind, and to return all the presents and letters which she had ever had from him. She promised acquiescence and tried to obey. She put up the 2 or 3 trinkets, and as for the letters, she drew them out of the place where she kept them and read them over, as if she did not know them by heart already. But she could not part with them. That effort was too much for her. She placed them back in her bosom again, as you have seen a woman nurse a child that is dead. Young Amelia felt that she would die or lose her senses outright if torn away from this last consolation. How she used to blush and lighten up when those letters came! How she used to trip away with a beating heart so that she might read unseen! If they were cold, yet how perversely this fond little soul interpreted them into warmth! If they were short or selfish, what excuses she found for the writer! It was over these few worthless papers that she brooded and brooded. She lived in her past life. Every letter seemed to recall some circumstance of it. How well she remembered them all. His looks and tones, his dress, what he said and how. These relics and remembrances of dead affection were all that left her in the world, and the business of her life was to watch the corpse of love. To death she looked with inexpressible longing. Then she thought, I shall always be able to follow him. I am not praising her conduct or setting her up as a model for Miss Bullock to imitate. Miss B knows how to regulate her feelings better than this poor little creature. Miss B would never have committed herself as that imprudent Amelia had done. pledged her love irretrievably, confessed her heart away, and got back nothing, only a brittle promise which was snapped and worthless in a moment. A long engagement is a partnership, which one party is free to keep or break, but which involves all the capital of the other. Be cautious then, young ladies. Be wary how you engage. Be shy of loving frankly. Never tell all you feel, or, a better way still, feel very little. See the consequences of being prematurely honest and confiding, and mistrust yourselves and everybody. Get yourselves married as they do in France, where the lawyers are the bridesmaids and confidants. At any rate, never have any feelings which may make you uncomfortable, or make any promises which you cannot at any required moment command and withdraw. That is the way to get on, and be respected, and have a virtuous character in Vanity Fair. If Amelia could have heard the comments regarding her which were made in the circle from which her father's ruin had just driven her, she would have seen what her own crimes were, and how entirely her character was jeopardized. Such criminal imprudence Mrs. Smith never knew of. Such horrid familiarities Mrs. Brown had always condemned, and the end might be a warning to her daughters. Captain Osborne, of course, could not marry a bankrupt's daughter, the Mrs. Dauben said. It was quite enough to have been swindled by the father. As for that little Amelia, her folly had really passed all. All what? Captain Dauben roared out. Haven't they been engaged ever since they were children? Wasn't it as good as a marriage? Dare any soul on earth breathe a word against the sweetest, the purest, the tenderest, the most angelical of young women? La, William, don't be so highty-tighty with us. We're not men, we can't fight you, Miss Jane said. We've said nothing against Miss Sedley, but that her conduct throughout was most imprudent, not to call it by any worse name, and that her parents are people who certainly merit their misfortunes. Hadn't you better, now that Miss Sedley is free, propose for her yourself, William? Miss Anne asked sarcastically. It would be a most eligible family connection. I marry her, Dauben said, blushing very much and talking quick. If you are so ready, young ladies, to chop and change, do you suppose that she is? Laugh and sneer at that angel. She can't hear it, and she's miserable and unfortunate, and deserves to be laughed at. Go on joking, Anne. You're the wit of the family, and the others like to hear it. I must tell you again, we're not in a barrack, William, Miss Anne remarked. In a barrack, by Jove! I wish anybody in a barrack would say what you do, cried out this uproosed British lion. I should like to hear a man breathe a word against her, by Jupiter. But men don't talk in this way, Anne. It's only women who get together and hiss and shriek and cackle. There, get away. Don't begin to cry. I only said you were a couple of geese. Will Dauben said, perceiving Miss Anne's pink eyes were beginning to moisten as usual. Well, you're not geese, you're swans. Anything you like. Only do leave Miss Sedley alone. Anything like William's infatuation about that silly little flirting, ogling thing was never known. The mamma and sisters agreed together in thinking, and they trembled lest, her engagement being off with Osborne, she would take up immediately her other admirer and captain. In which forebodings these worthy young women no doubt judged according to the best of their experience, or rather, for as yet they had had no opportunities of marrying or of jilting, according to their own notions of right and wrong. It is a mercy, mamma, that the regiment is ordered abroad, the girls said. This danger, at any rate, is spared our brother. Such, indeed, was the fact, and so it is that the French emperor comes in to perform a part in this domestic comedy of Vanity Fair, which we are now playing, and which never would have been enacted without the intervention of this august mute personage. It was he that ruined the Bourbons and Mr. John Sedley. It was he whose arrival in his capital called up all France in arms to defend him there, and all Europe to oust him, while the French nation and army were swearing fidelity round the eagles in the Champ de Mars. 4 mighty European hosts were getting in motion for the great Chasse à l'Aigle, and one of these was a British army, of which 2 heroes of ours, Captain Dauben and Captain Osborne, formed a portion. The news of Napoleon's escape and landing was received by the gallant with a fiery delight and enthusiasm, which everybody can understand who knows that famous corps. From the colonel to the smallest drummer in the regiment, all were filled with hope and ambition and patriotic fury, and thanked the French emperor as for a personal kindness in coming to disturb the peace of Europe. Now was the time that they had so long panted for, to show their comrades in arms that they could fight as well as the peninsular veterans, and that all the pluck and valor of them had not been killed by the West Indies and the yellow fever. Stubble and Spooney looked to get their companies without purchase. Before the end of the campaign, which she resolved to share, Mrs. Major O'Dowd hoped to write herself Mrs. Colonel O'Dowd, C.B. Our 2 friends, Dauben and Osborne, were quite as much excited as the rest, and each in his own way. Mr. Dauben very quietly, Mr. Osborne very loudly and energetically, was bent upon doing his duty and gaining his share of honor and distinction. The agitation thrilling through the country and army in consequence of this news was so great that private matters were little heeded, and hence probably George Osborne just gazetted to his company, busy with preparations for the march, which must come inevitably, and panting for further promotion, was not so much affected by other incidents which would have interested him at a more quiet period. He was not, it must be confessed, very much cast down by good old Mr. Sedley's catastrophe. He tried his new uniform, which became him very handsomely, on the day when the first meeting of the creditors of the unfortunate gentleman took place. His father told him of the wicked, rascally, shameful conduct of the bankrupt, reminded him of what he had said about Amelia, and that their connection was broken off forever, and gave him that evening a good sum of money to pay for the new clothes and epaulets in which he looked so well. Money was always useful to this free-handed young fellow, and he took it without many words. The bills were up in the Sedley house where he had passed so many happy hours. He could see them as he walked from home that night to the old Slaughter's, where he put up when in town, shining white in the moon. That comfortable home was shut, then, upon Amelia and her parents. Where had they taken refuge? The thought of their ruin affected him not a little. He was very melancholy that night in the coffee room at the Slaughter's, and drank a good deal, as his comrades remarked there. Dauben came in presently, cautioned him about the drink, which he only took, he said, because he was deuced low. But when his friend began to put to him clumsy inquiries and asked him for news in a significant manner, Osborne declined entering into conversation with him, avowing, however, that he was devilish disturbed and unhappy. 3 days afterwards, Dauben found Osborne in his room at the barracks, his head on the table, a number of papers about, the young captain evidently in a state of great despondency. She sent me back some things I gave her, some damned trinkets. Look here. There was a little packet directed in the well-known hand to Captain George Osborne, and some things lying about, a ring, a silver knife he had bought as a boy for her at the fair, a gold chain, and a locket with hair in it. It's all over, said he with a groan of sickening remorse. Look, Will, you may read it if you like. There was a little letter of a few lines to which he pointed, which said, "My papa has ordered me to return to you these presents, which you made in happier days to me, and I am to write to you for the last time. I think I know you feel as much as I do the blow which has come upon us. It is I that absolve you from an engagement which is impossible in our present misery. I am sure you had no share in it, or in the cruel suspicions of Mr. Osborne, which are the hardest of all our griefs to bear. Farewell, farewell. I pray God to strengthen me to bear this and other calamities, and to bless you always. A. I shall often play upon the piano, your piano. It was like you to send it. Dauben was very soft-hearted. The sight of women and children in pain always used to melt him. The idea of Amelia, broken-hearted and lonely, tore that good-natured soul with anguish, and he broke out into an emotion which anybody who likes may consider unmanly. He swore that Amelia was an angel, to which Osborne said aye with all his heart. He, too, had been reviewing the history of their lives, and had seen her from her childhood to her present age, so sweet, so innocent, so charmingly simple, and artlessly fond and tender. What a pang it was to lose all that, to have had it and not prized it. 1,000 homely scenes and recollections crowded on him, in which he always saw her good and beautiful. And for himself, he blushed with remorse and shame as the remembrance of his own selfishness and indifference contrasted with that perfect purity. For a while, glory, war, everything was forgotten, and the pair of friends talked about her only. Where are they? Osborne asked, after a long talk and a long pause, and in truth with no little shame at thinking that he had taken no steps to follow her. Where are they? There's no address to the note. Dauben knew. He had not merely sent the piano, but had written a note to Mrs. Sedley and asked permission to come and see her. And he had seen her, and Amelia too, yesterday, before he came down to Chatham. And what is more, he had brought that farewell letter and packet which had so moved them. The good-natured fellow had found Mrs. Sedley only too willing to receive him, and greatly agitated by the arrival of the piano, which, as she conjectured, must have come from George, and was a signal of amity on his part. Captain Dauben did not correct this error of the worthy lady, but listened to all her story of complaints and misfortunes with great sympathy, condoled her with losses and privations, and agreed in reprehending the cruel conduct of Mr. Osborne towards his first benefactor. When she had erased her overflowing bosom somewhat, and poured forth many of her sorrows, he had the courage to actually ask to see Amelia, who was above in her room as usual, and whom her mother led trembling downstairs. Her appearance was so ghastly, and her look of despair so pathetic, that honest William Dauben was frightened as he beheld it, and read the most fatal forebodings in that pale, fixed face. After sitting in his company a minute or two, she put the packet into his hand and said, "Take this to Captain Osborne, if you please, and I hope he's quite well. And it was very kind of you to come and see us, and we like our new house very much. And I think I'll go upstairs, Mamma, for I'm not very strong." And with this, and a curtsy and a smile, the poor child went her way. The mother, as she led her up, cast back looks of anguish towards Dauben. The good fellow wanted no such appeal. He loved her himself too fondly for that. Inexpressible grief and pity and terror pursued him, and he came away as if he was a criminal after seeing her. When Osborne heard that his friend had found her, he made hot and anxious inquiries regarding the poor child. How was she? How did she look? What did she say? His comrade took his hand and looked him in the face. "George, she's dying," William Dauben said, and could speak no more. There was a buxom Irish servant girl, who performed all the duties of the little house where the Sedley family had found refuge, and this girl had in vain, on many previous days, striven to give Amelia aid or consolation. Emmy was much too sad to answer or even to be aware of the attempts the other was making in her favor. 4 hours after the talk between Dauben and Osborne, the servant maid came into Amelia's room, where she sate as usual, brooding silently over her letters, her little treasures. The girl, smiling and looking arch and happy, made many trials to attract poor Emmy's attention, who, however, took no heed of her. "Miss Emmy," said the girl. "I'm coming," Emmy said, not looking around. "There's a message," the maid went on. "There's somebody. Sure, here's a new letter for you. Don't be reading them old ones any more." And she gave her a letter which Emmy took and read. "I must see you," the letter said. "Dearest Emmy, dearest love, dearest wife, come to me." George and her mother were outside waiting until she had read the letter. Chapter 19. Miss Crawley at Nurse. We have seen how Mrs. Firkin, the lady's maid, as soon as any event of importance to the Crawley family came to her knowledge, felt bound to communicate it to Mrs. Bute Crawley at the rectory, and have before mentioned how particularly kind and attentive that good-natured lady was to Miss Crawley's confidential servant. She had been a gracious friend to Miss Briggs, the companion also, and had secured the latter's goodwill by a number of those attentions and promises which cost so little in the making, and are yet so valuable and agreeable to the recipient. Indeed, every good economist and manager of a household must know how cheap and yet how amiable these professions are, and what a flavor they give to the most homely dish in life. Who was the blundering idiot who said that fine words butter no parsnips? Half the parsnips of society are served and rendered palatable with no other sauce. As the immortal Alexis Soyer can make more delicious soup for a halfpenny than an ignorant cook can concoct with pounds of vegetables and meat, so a skillful artist will make a few simple and pleasing phrases go farther than ever so much substantial benefit stock in the hands of a mere bungler. Nay, we know that substantial benefits often sicken some stomachs, whereas most will digest any amount of fine words, and be always eager for more of the same food. Mrs. Bute had told Briggs and Firkin so often of the depth of her affection for them, and what she would do if she had Miss Crawley's fortune, for friends so excellent and attached that the ladies in question had the deepest regard for her, and felt as much gratitude and confidence as if Miss Bute had loaded them with the most expensive favors. Rawdon Crawley, on the other hand, like a selfish, heavy dragoon as he was, never took the least trouble to conciliate his aunt's aides de camp, showed his contempt for the pair with entire frankness, made Firkin pull off his boots on one occasion, sent her out in the rain on ignominious messages, and if he gave her a guinea, flung it to her as if it were a box on the ear. As his aunt, too, made a butt of Briggs, the captain followed the example and leveled his jokes at her, jokes about as delicate as a kick from his charger, whereas Mrs. Bute consulted her in matters of taste or difficulty, admired her poetry, and by 1,000 acts of kindness and politeness showed her appreciation of Briggs. And if she made Firkin a 2-penny halfpenny present, accompanied it with so many compliments that the 2 pence halfpenny was transmuted into gold in the heart of the grateful waiting maid, who, besides, was looking forwards quite contentedly with some prodigious benefit, which must happen to her on the day when Mrs. Bute came into her fortune. The different conduct of these two people is pointed out respectfully to the attention of persons commencing the world. Praise everybody, I say to such. Never be squeamish, but speak out your compliment, both point blank in a man's face and behind his back when you know there is a reasonable chance of his hearing it again. Never lose a chance of saying a kind word. As Collingwood never saw a vacant place in his estate, but he took an acorn out of his pocket and popped it in. So deal with your compliments through life. An acorn costs nothing, but it may sprout into a prodigious bit of timber. In a word, during Rawdon Crawley's prosperity, he was only obeyed with sulky acquiescence. When his disgrace came, there was nobody to help or pity him. Whereas when Mrs. Bute took the command at Miss Crawley's house, the garrison there were charmed to act under such a leader, expecting all sorts of promotion from her promises, her generosity, and her kind words. That he would consider himself beaten after one defeat, and make no attempt to regain the position he had lost, Mrs. Bute Crawley never allowed herself to suppose. She knew Rebecca to be too clever and spirited and desperate a woman to submit without a struggle, and felt that she must prepare for that combat and be incessantly watchful against assault or mine or surprise. In the first place, though she held the town, was she sure of the principal inhabitant? Would Miss Crawley herself hold out, and had she not a secret longing to welcome back the ousted adversary? The old lady liked Rawdon and Rebecca, who amused her. Mrs. Bute could not disguise from herself the fact that none of her party could so contribute to the pleasures of the town-bred lady. My girl's singing after that little odious governess's, I know, is unbearable. The candid rector's wife owned to herself. She always used to go to sleep when Martha and Louisa played their duets. Jim's stiff college manners and poor dear Bute's talk about his dogs and horses always annoyed her. If I took her to the rectory, she would grow angry with us all and fly, I know she would, and might fall into that horrid Rawdon's clutches again, and be the victim of that little viper of a Sharp. Meanwhile, it is clear to me that she is exceedingly unwell and cannot move for some weeks at any rate, during which we must think of some plan to protect her from the arts of those unprincipled people. In the very best of moments, if anybody told Miss Crawley that she was or looked ill, the trembling old lady sent off for her doctor, and I dare say she was very unwell after the sudden family event, which might serve to shake stronger nerves than hers. At least, Mrs. Bute thought it was her duty to inform the physician, and the apothecary, and the dame de compagnie, and the domestics, that Miss Crawley was in a most critical state, and that they were to act accordingly. She had the street laid knee-deep with straw, and the knocker put by with Mr. Bowles's plate. She insisted that the doctor should call twice a day, and deluged her patient with draughts every 2 hours. When anybody entered the room, she uttered a shh, so sibilant and ominous that it frightens the poor old lady in her bed, from which she could not look without seeing Mrs. Bute's beady eyes eagerly fixed on her, as the latter sate steadfast in the armchair by the bedside. They seemed to lighten in the dark, for she kept the curtains closed, as she moved about the room on velvet paws like a cat. There Miss Crawley lay for days, ever so many days, Mr. Bute reading books of devotion to her, for nights, long nights, during which she had to hear the watchman sing, the night lights sputter. Visited at midnight, the last thing, by the stealthy apothecary, and then left to look at Mrs. Bute's twinkling eyes, or the flakes of yellow that the rushlight threw on the dreary, darkened ceiling. Hygia herself would have fallen sick under such a regimen, and how much more this poor old nervous victim. It has been said that when she was in health and good spirit, this venerable inhabitant of Vanity Fair had as free notions about religion and morals as Monsieur de Voltaire himself could desire. But when illness overtook her, it was aggravated by the most dreadful terrors of death, and an utter cowardice took possession of the prostrate old sinner. Sick-bed homilies and pious reflections are, to be sure, out of place in mere storybooks, and we are not going, after the fashion of some novelists of the present day, to cajole the public into a sermon when it is only a comedy that the reader pays his money to witness. But without preaching, the truth may surely be borne in mind that the bustle and triumph and laughter and gaiety which Vanity Fair exhibits in public do not always pursue the performer into private life, and that the most dreary depression of spirits and dismal repentances sometimes overcome him. Recollection of the best ordained banquets will scarcely cheer sick epicures. Reminiscences of the most becoming dresses and brilliant ball triumphs will go very little to console faded beauties. Perhaps statesmen at a particular period of existence are not much gratified at thinking over the most triumphant divisions, and the success or the pleasure of yesterday, which becomes of very small account when a certain, albeit uncertain, morrow is in view, about which all of us must some day or other be speculating. O brother wearers of motley, are there not moments when one grows sick of grinning and tumbling and the jingling of caps and bells? This, dear friends and companions, is my amiable object, to walk with you through the fair, to examine the shops and the shows there, and that we should all come home after the flare and the noise and the gaiety, and be perfectly miserable in private. If that poor man of mine had a head on his shoulders, Mrs. Bute Crawley thought to herself, how useful he might be under present circumstances to this unhappy old lady. He might make her repent of her shocking free-thinking ways. He might urge her to do her duty and cast off that odious reprobate who has disgraced himself and his family. And he might induce her to do justice to my dear girls and the 2 boys who require and deserve, I am sure, every assistance which their relatives can give them. And as the hatred of vice is always a progress towards virtue, Mrs. Bute Crawley endeavored to instill her sister-in-law a proper abhorrence for all Rawdon Crawley's manifold sins, of which his uncle's wife brought forward such a catalogue as indeed would have served to condemn a whole regiment of young officers. If a man has committed wrong in his life, I don't know any moralist more anxious to point his errors out to the world than his own relations. So Mrs. Bute showed a perfect family interest and knowledge of Rawdon's history. She had all the particulars of that ugly quarrel with Captain Marker, in which Rawdon, wrong from the beginning, ended in shooting the captain. She knew how the unhappy Lord Dovedale, whose mamma had taken a house at Oxford so that he might be educated there, and who had never touched a card in his life till he came to London, was perverted by Rawdon at the Cocoa Tree, made helplessly tipsy by this abominable seducer and perverter of youth, and fleeced of £4,000. She described with the most vivid minuteness the agonies of the country families whom he had ruined, the sons whom he had plunged into dishonor and poverty, the daughters whom he had inveigled into perdition. She knew the poor tradesmen who were bankrupt by his extravagance, the mean shifts and rogueries with which he had ministered to it, the astounding falsehoods by which he had imposed upon the most generous of aunts, and the ingratitude and ridicule by which he had repaid her sacrifices. She imparted these stories gradually to Miss Crawley, gave her the whole benefit of them, felt it to be her bounden duty as a Christian woman and mother of a family to do so, had not the smallest remorse or compunction for the victim whom her tongue was immolating, nay, very likely thought her act was quite meritorious, and plumed herself upon her resolute manner of performing it. Yes, if a man's character is to be abused, say what you will, there's nobody like a relation to do the business. And one is bound to own, regarding this unfortunate wretch of a Rawdon Crawley, that the mere truth was enough to condemn him, and that all inventions of scandal were quite superfluous pains on his friend's part. Rebecca, too, being now a relative, came in for the fullest share of Mrs. Bute's kind inquiries. This indefatigable pursuer of truth, having given strict orders that the door was to be denied to all emissaries or letters from Rawdon, took Miss Crawley's carriage and drove to her old friend Miss Pinkerton at Minerva House, Chiswick Mall, to whom she announced the dreadful intelligence of Captain Rawdon's seduction by Miss Sharp, and from whom she got sundry strange particulars regarding the ex-governess's birth and early history. The friend of the lexicographer had plenty of information to give. Miss Jemima was made to fetch the drawing master's receipts and letters. This one was from a sponging house that entreated an advance. Another was full of gratitude for Rebecca's reception by the ladies of Chiswick. And the last document from the unlucky artist's pen was that in which, from his dying bed, he recommended his orphan child to Miss Pinkerton's protection. There were juvenile letters and petitions from Rebecca, too, in the collection, imploring aid for her father or declaring her own gratitude. Perhaps in Vanity Fair there are no better satires than letters. Take a bundle of your dear friends of 10 years back, your dear friend whom you hate now. Look at a file of your sisters, how you clung to each other till you quarreled about the 20-pound legacy. Get down the round-hand scrawls of your son who has half broken your heart with selfish undutifulness since, or a parcel of your own, breathing endless ardor and love eternal, which were sent back by your mistress when she married the Nabob, your mistress, for whom you now care no more than for Queen Elizabeth. Vows, love, promises, confidences, gratitude. How queerly they read after a while. There ought to be a law in Vanity Fair ordering the destruction of every written document, except receipted tradesmen's bills, after a certain brief and proper interval. Those quacks and misanthropes who advertise indelible Japan ink should be made to perish along with their wicked discoveries. The best ink for Vanity Fair should be one that faded utterly in a couple of days, and left the paper clean and blank, so that you might write on it to somebody else. From Miss Pinkerton's, the indefatigable Mrs. Bute followed the track of Sharp and his daughter back to the lodgings in Greek Street, which the defunct painter had occupied, and where portraits of the landlady in white satin and of the husband in brass buttons, done by Sharp in lieu of a quarter's rent, still decorated the parlor walls. Mrs. Stokes was a communicative person, and quickly told all she knew about Mr. Sharp, how dissolute and poor he was, how good-natured and amusing, how he was always hunted by bailiffs and duns, how, to the landlady's horror, though she never could abide the woman, he did not marry his wife till a short time before her death. And what a queer little wild vixen his daughter was, how she kept them all laughing with her fun and mimicry, how she used to fetch the gin from the public house, and was known in all the studios in the quarter. In brief, Mrs. Bute got such a full account of her niece's parentage, education, and behavior as would scarcely have pleased Rebecca, had the latter known that such inquiries were being made concerning her. Of all these industrious researches, Miss Crawley had the full benefit. Mrs. Rawdon Crawley was the daughter of an opera girl. She had danced herself. She had been a model to the painters. She was brought up as became her mother's daughter. She drank gin with her father, etc., etc. It was a lost woman who was married to a lost man. And the moral to be inferred from Mrs. Bute's tale was, that the knavery of the pair was irremediable, and that no properly conducted person should ever notice them again. These were the materials which prudent Mrs. Bute gathered together in Park Lane, the provisions and ammunition, as it were, with which she fortified the house against the siege which she knew that Rawdon and his wife would lay to Miss Crawley. But if a fault may be found with her arrangements, it is this, that she was too eager. She managed rather too well. Undoubtedly, she made Miss Crawley more ill than was necessary, and though the old invalid succumbed to her authority, it was so harassing and severe that the victim would be inclined to escape at the very first chance which fell in her way. Managing women, the ornaments of their sex, women who order everything for everybody, and know so much better than any person concerned what is good for their neighbors, don't sometimes speculate upon the possibility of a domestic revolt, or upon other extreme consequences resulting from their overstrained authority. Thus, for instance, Mrs. Bute, with the best intentions no doubt in the world, and wearing herself to death as she did by foregoing sleep, dinner, fresh air, for the sake of her invalid sister-in-law, carried her conviction of the old lady's illness so far that she almost managed her into her coffin. She pointed out her sacrifices and their results one day to the constant apothecary, Mr. Clump. "I am sure, my dear Mr. Clump," she said, "no efforts of mine have been wanting to restore our dear invalid, whom the ingratitude of her nephew has laid on the bed of sickness. I never shrink from personal discomfort. I never refuse to sacrifice myself." "Your devotion, it must be confessed, is admirable," Mr. Clump says with a low bow, "but I have scarcely closed my eyes since my arrival. I give up sleep, health, every comfort to my sense of duty. When my poor James was in the smallpox, did I allow any hireling to nurse him? No. You did what became an excellent mother, my dear madame, the best of mothers. But, as the mother of a good family and the wife of an English clergyman, I humbly trust that my principles are good," Mrs. Bute said with a happy solemnity of conviction. "And, as long as nature supports me, never, never, Mr. Clump, will I desert the post of duty. Others may bring that gray head with sorrow to the bed of sickness." Here, Mrs. Bute, waving her hand, pointed to one of old Miss Crawley's coffee-colored fronts, which was perched on a stand in the dressing-room. "But I will never quit it. Ah, Mr. Clump, I fear I know that the couch needs spiritual as well as medical consolation." "What I was going to observe, my dear madam," here the resolute Clump once more interposed with a bland air, "what I was going to observe when you gave utterance to sentiments which you do so much honor, was that I think you alarm yourself needlessly about our kind friend, and sacrifice your own health too prodigally in her favor." "I would lay down my life for my duty, or for any other member of my husband's family," Mrs. Bute interposed. "Yes, madam, if need were. But we don't want Mrs. Bute Crawley to be a martyr," Clump said gallantly. "Dr. Squills and myself have both considered Miss Crawley's case with every anxiety and care, as you may suppose. We see her low-spirited and nervous. Family events have agitated her." "Her nephew will come to perdition," Miss Rawley cried. "Have agitated her, and you arrived like a guardian angel, my dear madam, a positive guardian angel, I assure you, to soothe her under the pressure of calamity. But Dr. Squills and I were thinking that our amiable friend is not in such a state as renders confinement to her bed necessary. She is depressed, but this confinement perhaps adds to her depression. She should have change, fresh air, gaiety, the most delightful remedies in the pharmacopoeia," Mr. Clump said, grinning and showing his handsome teeth. "Persuade her to rise, dear madam, drag her from her couch and her low spirits, insist upon her taking little drives. They will restore the roses too to your cheeks, if I may so speak to Mrs. Bute Crawley." The sight of her horrid nephew casually in the park, where I am told the wretch drives with the brazen partner of his crimes, Mrs. Butte said, letting the cat of selfishness out of the bag of secrecy, would cause her such a shock that we should have to bring her back to bed again. She must not go out, Mr. Clump. She shall not go out as long as I remain to watch over her. And as for my health, what matters it? I give it cheerfully, sir. I sacrifice it at the altar of my duty. Upon my word, madam, Mr. Clump said, now bluntly, I won't answer for her life as she remains locked up in that dark room. She's so nervous that we may lose her any day, and if you wish Captain Crawley to be her heir, I warn you frankly, madam, that you are doing your very best to serve him. Gracious mercy, is her life in danger? Mrs. Butte cried. Why, Mr. Clump, did you not inform me sooner? The night before, Mr. Clump and Dr. Squills had had a consultation over a bottle of wine at the house of Sir Lepine Warren, whose lady was about to present him with a 13th blessing, regarding Miss Crawley and her case. What a little harpy that woman from Hampshire is, Clump, Squills remarked, that has seized upon old Tilly Crawley. Devilish good Madeira. What a fool Rawdon Crawley has been, Clump replied, to go and marry a governess. There was something about the girl, too. Green eyes, fair skin, pretty figure, famous frontal development, Squills remarked. There is something about her, and Crawley was a fool, Squills. A damned fool, always was, the apothecary replied. Of course the old girl will fling him over, said the physician, and after a pause added, She'll cut up well, I suppose. Cut up, says Clump with a grin. I wouldn't have her cut up for 200 a year. That Hampshire woman will kill her in 2 months, Clump, my boy, if she stops about her. Dr. Squills said, Old woman, full feeder, nervous subject, palpitation of the heart, pressure on the brain, apoplexy, off she goes. Get her up, Clump, get her out, or I wouldn't give many weeks' purchase for your 200 a year. And it was acting upon this hint that the worthy apothecary spoke with so much candor to Mrs. Butte Crawley. Having the old lady under her hand, in bed, with nobody near, Mrs. Butte had made more than one assault upon her to induce her to alter her will. But Miss Crawley's usual terrors regarding death increased greatly when such dismal propositions were made to her, and Mrs. Butte saw that she must get her patient into cheerful spirits and health before she could hope to attain the pious object which she had in view. Whither to take her was the next puzzle. The only place where she is not likely to meet that odious Rawdon is at church, and that won't amuse her, Mrs. Butte justly felt. We must go and visit our beautiful suburbs of London, she then thought. I hear they are most picturesque in the world. And so she had a sudden interest for Hampstead and Hornsey, and found that Dulwich had great charms for her, and getting her victim into her carriage, drove her to those rustic spots, beguiling the little journeys with conversations about Rawdon and his wife, and telling every story to the old lady which could add to her indignation against this pair of reprobates. Perhaps Mrs. Butte pulled the string unnecessarily tight, for though she worked up Miss Crawley to a proper dislike of her disobedient nephew, the invalid had a great hatred and secret terror of her victimizer, and panted to escape from her. After a brief space, she rebelled against Highgate and Hornsey utterly. She would go into the park. Mrs. Butte knew they would meet the abominable Rawdon there, and she was right. One day, in the ring, Rawdon's Stanhope came in sight. Rebecca was seated by him. In the enemy's equipage, Miss Crawley occupied her usual place, with Mrs. Butte on her left, the poodle and Miss Briggs on the back seat. It was a nervous moment, and Rebecca's heart beat quick as she recognized the carriage, and as the two vehicles crossed each other in a line, she clasped her hands and looked towards the spinster with a face of agonized attachment and devotion. Rawdon himself trembled, and his face grew purple behind his dyed mustachios. Only old Briggs was moved in the other carriage, and cast her great eyes nervously towards her old friends. Miss Crawley's bonnet was resolutely turned towards the Serpentine. Mrs. Bute happened to be in ecstasies with the poodle, and was calling him a little darling and a sweet little zoggy and a pretty pet. The carriages moved on, each in his line. "Done, by Jove," Rawdon said to his wife. "Try once more, Rawdon," Rebecca answered. "Could you not lock your wheels into theirs, dearest?" Rawdon had not the heart for that maneuver. When the carriages met again, he stood up in his stanhope. He raised his hand, ready to doff his hat. He looked with all his eyes. But this time, Miss Crawley's face was not turned away. She and Mrs. Bute looked him full in the face, and cut their nephew pitilessly. He sank back in his seat with an oath, and striking out of the ring, dashed away desperately homewards. It was a gallant and decided triumph for Mrs. Bute, but she felt the danger of many such meetings, as she saw the evident nervousness of Miss Crawley, and she determined that it was most necessary for her dear friend's health that they should leave town for a while, and recommended Brighton very strongly. Chapter 20, in which Dauben acts as the messenger of Hymen. Without knowing how, Captain William Dauben found himself the great promoter, arranger, and manager of the match between George Osborne and Amelia. But for him, it never would have taken place. He could not but confess as much to himself, and smiled rather bitterly as he thought that he of all men in the world should be the person upon whom the care of this marriage had fallen. But though indeed the conducting of this negotiation was about as painful a task as could be set to him, yet when he had the duty to perform, Captain Dauben was accustomed to go through it without many words or much hesitation. And, having made up his mind completely that if Miss Sedley was balked of her husband, she would die of the disappointment, he was determined to use all his best endeavors to keep her alive. I forbear to enter into minute particulars of the interview between George and Amelia, when the former was brought back to the feet, or should we venture to say the arms, of his young mistress by the intervention of his friend honest William. A much harder heart than George's would have melted at the sight of that sweet face so sadly ravaged by grief and despair, and at the simple tender accents in which she told her little broken-hearted story. But as she did not faint when her mother, trembling, brought Osborne to her, and as she only gave relief to her overcharged grief by laying her head on her lover's shoulder, and there, weeping for a while, the most tender, copious, and refreshing tears, old Mrs. Sedley, too greatly relieved, thought it was best to leave the young persons to themselves, and so quitted Emmy crying over George's hand, and kissing it humbly as if he were her supreme chief and master, and as if she were quite a guilty and unworthy person, needing every favor and grace from him. This prostration and sweet unrepining obedience exquisitely touched and flattered George Osborne. He saw a slave before him in that simple, yielding, faithful creature, and his soul within him thrilled secretly somehow at the knowledge of his power. He would be generous-minded, sultan as he was, and raise up this kneeling Esther and make a queen of her. Besides, her sadness and beauty touched him as much as her submission, and so he cheered her and raised her up and forgave her, so to speak. All her hopes and feelings which were dying and withering, this her son having been removed from her, bloomed again and at once, its light being restored. You would scarcely have recognized the beaming little face upon Amelia's pillow that night as the one that laid there the night before, so wan, so lifeless, so careless of all round about. The honest Irish maid-servant, delighted with the change, asked leave to kiss the face that had grown all of a sudden so rosy. Amelia put her arms round the girl's neck and kissed her with all her heart, like a child. She was little more. She had that night a sweet, refreshing sleep like one, and what a spring of inexpressible happiness as she woke up in the morning sunshine. He will be here again today, Amelia thought. He is the greatest and best of men. And the fact is that George thought he was one of the generousest creatures alive, and that he was making a tremendous sacrifice in marrying this young creature. While she and Osborne were having their delightful tete-a-tete above stairs, old Mrs. Sedley and Captain Dauben were conversing below upon the state of the affairs, and the chances and future arrangements of the young people. Mrs. Sedley, having brought the two lovers together, and left them embracing each other with all their might like a true woman, was of opinion that no power on earth would induce Mr. Sedley to consent to the match between his daughter and the son of a man who had so shamefully, wickedly, and monstrously treated him. And she told a long story about happier days and their earlier splendors, when Osborne lived in a very humble way in the New Road, and his wife was too glad to receive some of Joseph's little baby things, and which Mrs. Sedley accommodated her at the birth of one of Osborne's own children. The fiendish ingratitude of that man, she was sure, had broken Mr. S.'s heart, and as for a marriage, he would never, 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 never consent. "They must run away together, ma'am," Dauben said, laughing, "and follow the example of Captain Rod and Crawley, and Miss Emmy's friend, the little governess." Was it possible? Well, she never. Mrs. Sedley was all excitement about this news. She wished that Blenkinsop were here to hear it. Blenkinsop always mistrusted that Miss Sharp. What an escape Jos had had! And she described the already well-known love passages between Rebecca and the collector of Bogley-Wollah. It was not, however, Mr. Sedley's wrath which Dauben feared, so much as that of the other parents concerned, and he owns that he had a very considerable doubt and anxiety respecting the behavior of the black-browed old tyrant of a Russia merchant in Russell Square. He has forbidden the match, peremptorily, Dauben thought. He knew what a savage, determined man Osborne was, and how he stuck by his word. The only chance George has of reconcilement, argued his friend, is by distinguishing himself in the coming campaign. If he dies, they both go together. If he fails in distinction, what then? He has some money from his mother. I have heard enough to purchase his majority. Or he must sell out and go and dig in Canada, or rough it in a cottage in the country. With such a partner, Dauben thought he would not mind Siberia. And strange to say, this absurd and utterly imprudent young fellow never for a moment considered that the want of means to keep a nice carriage and horses, and an income which should enable its possessors to entertain their friends genteelly, ought to operate as bars to the union of George and Miss Sedley. It was these weighty considerations which made him think too that the marriage should take place as quickly as possible. Was he anxious himself, I wonder, to have it over? As people, when death has occurred, like to press forward the funeral, or when a parting is resolved upon, hasten it. It is certain that Mr. Dauben, having taken the matter in hand, was most extraordinarily eager in the conduct of it. He urged on George the necessity of immediate action. He showed the chances of reconciliation with his father, which a favorable mention of his name in the Gazette must bring about. If need were, he would go himself and brave both the fathers in the business. At all events, he besought George to go through with it before the orders came, which everybody expected, for the departure of the regiment from England on foreign service. Bent upon these hymeneal projects, and with the applause and consent of Mrs. Sedley, who did not care to break the matter personally to her husband, Mr. Dauben went to seek John Sedley at his house of call in the city, the Tapioca Coffee House, where, since his own offices were shut up and fate had overtaken him, the poor, broken-down old gentleman used to betake himself daily, and write letters and receive them, and tie them up into mysterious bundles, several of which he carried in the flaps of his coat. I don't know anything more dismal than that business and bustle and mystery of a ruined man. Those letters from the wealthy which he shows you, those worn, greasy documents promising support and offering condolence which he places wistfully before you, and on which he builds his hopes of restoration and future fortune. My beloved reader has no doubt in the course of his experience been waylaid by many such a luckless companion. He takes you into the corner. He has his bundle of papers out of his gaping coat pocket, and the tape off and the string in his mouth, and the favorite letters selected and laid before you. And who does not know the sad, eager, half-crazy look which he fixes on you with his hopeless eyes? Changed into a man of this sort, Dauben found the once florid, jovial, and prosperous John Sedley. His coat, that used to be so glossy and trim, was white at the seams, and the buttons showed the copper. His face had fallen in and was unshorn. His frill and neckcloth hung limp under his bagging waistcoat. When he used to treat the boys in old days at the coffee house, he would shout and laugh louder than anybody there, and have all the waiters skipping round him. It was quite painful to see how humble and civil he was to John of the Tapioca, a blear-eyed old attendant in dingy stockings and cracked pumps, whose business it was to serve glasses of wafers and bumpers of ink and pewter, and slices of paper to the frequenters of this dreary house of entertainment, where nothing else seemed to be consumed. As for William Dauben, whom he had tipped repeatedly in his youth, and who had been the old gentleman's butt on 1,000 occasions, old Sedley gave his hand to him in a very hesitating, humble manner now, and called him Sir. A feeling of shame and remorse took possession of William Dauben, as the broken old man so received and addressed him, as if he himself had been somehow guilty of the misfortunes which had brought Sedley so low. "I am very glad to see you, Captain Dauben, sir," says he, after a skulking look or two at his visitor, whose lanky figure and military appearance caused some excitement likewise to twinkle in the blear eyes of the waiter in the cracked dancing pumps, and awakened the old lady in black, who dozed among the mouldy old coffee cups in the bar. "How is the worthy alderman and my lady, your excellent mother, sir?" He looked round at the waiter as he said, "My lady," as much as to say, "Hark ye, John, I have friends still, and persons of rank and reputation, too. Are you come to do anything in my way, sir? My young friends Dale and Spigot do all my business for me now, until my new offices are ready, for I'm only here temporarily, you know, Captain. What can we do for you, sir? Will you like to take anything?" Dauben, with a great deal of hesitation and stuttering, protested that he was not in the least hungry or thirsty, that he had no business to transact, that he only came to ask if Mr. Sedley was well, and to shake hands with an old friend. And he added with a desperate perversion of truth, "My mother is very well. That is, she's been very unwell, and is only waiting for the first fine day to go out and call upon Mrs. Sedley. How is Mrs. Sedley, sir? I hope she's quite well." And here he paused, reflecting on his own consummate hypocrisy. For the day was as fine, and the sunshine as bright as it ever is in the Coffin Court, where the Tapioca Coffee House is situated. And Mr. Dauben remembered that he had seen Mrs. Sedley himself only an hour before, having driven Osborne down to Fulham in his gig, and left him there, tete-a-tete with Miss Amelia. "My wife will be very happy to see her ladyship," Sedley replied, pulling out his papers. "I've a very kind letter here from your father, sir, and beg my respectful compliments to him. Lady D will find us in rather a smaller house than we were accustomed to receive our friends in, but it's snug, and the change of air does good to my daughter, who was suffering in town, rather. You remember little Emmy, sir? Yes, suffering a good deal. The old gentleman's eyes were wandering as he spoke, and he was thinking of something else, as he sate thrumming on his papers and fumbling at the worn red tape. You're a military man, he went on. I ask you, Bill Dauben, could any man ever have speculated upon the return of that Corsican scoundrel from Elba? When the Allied sovereigns were here last year, and we gave them that dinner in the city, sir, and we saw the Temple of Concord, and the fireworks, and the Chinese bridge in St. James's Park, could any sensible man suppose that peace wasn't really concluded after we'd actually sung Te Deum for it, sir? I ask you, William, could I suppose that the Emperor of Austria was a damned traitor, and nothing more? I don't mince words, a double-faced, infernal traitor and schemer, who meant to have his son-in-law back all along. And I say that the escape of Boney from Elba was a damned imposition and plot, sir, in which half the powers of Europe were concerned, to bring the funds down and to ruin this country. That's why I'm here, William. That's why my name's in the Gazette. Why, sir? Because I trusted the Emperor of Russia and the Prince Regent. Look here. Look at my papers. Look what the funds were on the 1st of March, what the French fives were when I bought for the Count, and what they're at now. There was collusion, sir, or that villain never would have escaped. Where was the English commissioner who allowed him to get away? He ought to be shot, sir, brought to a court-martial and shot, by Jove. We're going to hunt Boney out, sir, Dauben said, rather alarmed at the fury of the old man, the veins of whose forehead began to swell, and who sate drumming his papers with his clenched fist. We are going to hunt him out, sir. The Duke's in Belgium already, and we expect marching orders every day. Give him no quarter. Bring back the villain's head, sir. Shoot the coward down, sir, Sedley roared. I'd enlist myself but I'm a broken old man, ruined by that damned scoundrel, and by a parcel of swindling thieves in this country whom I made, sir, and who are rolling in their carriages now, he added with a break in his voice. Dauben was not a little affected by the sight of this once kind old friend, crazed, almost, with misfortune, and raving with senile anger. Pity the fallen gentleman, you to whom money and fair repute are the chiefest good, and so, surely, are they in Vanity Fair. Yes, he continued, there are some vipers that you warm and they sting you afterwards. There are some beggars that you put on horseback, and they're the first to ride you down. You know whom I mean, William Dauben, my boy. I mean a purse-proud villain in Russell Square, whom I knew without a shilling, and whom I pray and hope to see a beggar as he was when I befriended him. I've heard something of this, sir, from my friend George, Dauben said, anxious to come to his point. The quarrel between you and his father has cut him up a great deal, sir. Indeed, I'm the bearer of a message from him. Oh, that's your errand, is it? Cried the old man, jumping up. What? Perhaps he condoles with me, does he? Very kind of him, the stiff-backed prig, with his dandified airs and West End swagger. He's hankering about my house, is he still? If my son had the courage of a man, he'd shoot him. He's as big a villain as his father. I won't have his name mentioned in my house. I curse the day that I ever let him into it, and I'd rather see my daughter dead at my feet than married to him. His father's harshness is not George's fault, sir. Your daughter's love for him is as much your doing as his. Who are you, that you are to play with two young people's affections and break their hearts at your will? Recollect, it's not his father that breaks the match off, old Sedley cried out. It's I that forbid it. That family and mine are separated forever. I'm fallen low, but not so low as that. No. And so you may tell the whole race, son and fathers and sisters and all. It's my belief, sir, that you have not the power or the right to separate those two, Dauben answered in a low voice. and that if you don't give your daughter consent, it will be her duty to marry without it. There's no reason she should die or live miserably because you are wrong-headed. To my thinking, she's just as much married as if the bonds had been read in all the churches in London. And what better answer can there be to Osborne's charges against you, as charges there are, than that his son claims to enter your family and marry your daughter? A light of something like satisfaction seemed to break over old Sedley as this point was put to him. But he still persisted that with his consent, the marriage between Amelia and George should never take place. "We must do it without," Dauben said, smiling, and told Mr. Sedley, as he had told Mrs. Sedley in the day before, the story of Rebecca's elopement with Captain Crawley. It evidently amused the old gentleman. "You're terrible fellows, you captains," said he, tying up his papers, and his face wore something like a smile upon it, to the astonishment of the blear-eyed waiter who now entered, and had never seen such an expression upon Sedley's countenance since he had used the dismal coffee-house. The idea of hitting his enemy Osborne such a blow soothed, perhaps, the old gentleman, and their colloquy presently ended. He and Dauben parted pretty good friends. "My sisters say she has diamonds as big as pigeons' eggs," George said, laughing. "How they must set off her complexion! A perfect illumination it must be when her jewels are on her neck. Her jet-black hair is as curly as Sambo's. I dare say she wore a nose ring when she went to court, and with a plume of feathers in her top knot she would look a perfect Belle Sauvage." George, in conversation with Amelia, was rallying the appearance of a young lady of whom his father and sisters had lately made the acquaintance, and who was an object of vast respect to the Russell Square family. She was reported to have I don't know how many plantations in the West Indies, a deal of money in the funds, and 3 stars to her name in the East India stockholders list. She had a mansion in Surrey and house in Portland Place. The name of the rich West India heiress had been mentioned with applause in the Morning Post. Mrs. Haggiston, Colonel Haggiston's widow, her relative, chaperoned her and kept her house. She was just from school, where she had completed her education, and George and his sisters had met her at an evening party at old Holker's house, Devonshire Place. Holker, Bullock, and Co. were long the correspondents of her house in the West Indies, and the girls had made the most cordial advances towards her, which the heiress had received with great good humor. An orphan in her position, with her money, so interesting, the Mrs. Osborne said. They were full of their new friend when they returned from the Holker ball to Miss Wirt, their companion. They had made arrangements for continually meeting, and had the carriage and drove to see her the very next day. Mrs. Haggiston, Colonel Haggiston's widow, a relative of Lord Binkie, and always talking of him, struck the dear, unsophisticated girls as rather haughty, and too much inclined to talk about her great relations. But Rhoda was everything they could wish, the frankest, kindest, most agreeable creature, wanting a little polish, but so good-natured. The girls Christian-named each other at once. "You should have seen her dress for court, Emmy," Osborne cried, laughing. "She came to my sister's to show it off, before she was presented in state by my Lady Binkie, the Haggiston's kinswoman. She's related to everyone, that Haggiston. Her diamonds blazed out like Vauxhall on the night we were there. Do you remember Vauxhall, Emmy, and Jos singing to his dearest diddle-diddle darling? Diamonds and mahogany, my dear. Think what an advantageous contrast. And the white feathers in her hair, in her wool. She had earrings like chandeliers, you might have lighted 'em up, by Jove, and a yellow satin train that streeled after her like the tail of a comet." "How old is she?" asked Emmy, to whom George was rattling away regarding this dark paragon on the morning of their reunion, rattling away as no other man in the world surely could. "Why, the Black Princess, though she has only just left school, must be 2 or 3 and 20. And you should see the hand she writes. Mrs. Colonel Haggiston usually writes her letters, but in a moment of confidence, she put pen to paper for my sisters. She spelt satin satting, and St. James's St. Jams. Why, surely it must be Miss Swartz, the parlor boarder, Amy said, remembering that good-natured young mulatto girl who had been so hysterically affected when Amelia left Miss Pinkerton's academy. The very name, George said. Her father was a German Jew, a slave owner, they say, connected with the Cannibal Islands in some way or other. He died last year, and Miss Pinkerton has finished her education. She can play 2 pieces on the piano. She knows 3 songs. She can write when Mrs. Haggiston is by to spell for her. And Jane and Maria already have got to love her as a sister. I wish they would have loved me, said Emmy wistfully. They were always very cold to me. My dear child, they would have loved you if you had had 200,000 pounds, George replied. That is the way in which they have been brought up. Ours is a ready money society. We live among bankers and city bigwigs, and be hanged to them, and every man, as he talks to you, is jingling his guineas in his pocket. There's that jackass Fred Bullock is going to marry Maria. There's Goldmore, the East India director. There's Dipley in the tallow trade. Our trade, George said with an uneasy laugh and a blush. Curse the whole pack of money-grubbing vulgarians. I fall asleep at their great heavy dinners. I feel ashamed of my father's great stupid parties. I've been accustomed to live with gentlemen and men of the world and fashion, Emmy, not with a parcel of turtle-fed tradesmen. Dear little woman, you are the only person of our set who ever looked or thought or spoke like a lady, and you do it because you're an angel and can't help it. Don't remonstrate. You are the only lady. Didn't Miss Crawley remark it, who has lived in the best company in Europe? And as for Crawley of the Life Guards, hang it, he's a fine fellow, and I like him for marrying the girl he had chosen. Amelia admired Mr. Crawley very much, too, for this, and trusted Rebecca would be happy with him, and hoped, with a laugh, Jos would be consoled. And so the pair went on prattling as in quite early days, Amelia's confidence being perfectly restored to her, though she expressed a great deal of pretty jealousy about Miss Swartz, and professed to be dreadfully frightened, like a hypocrite as she was, lest George should forget her for the heiress and her money and her estates in St. Kitts. But the fact is, she was a great deal too happy to have fears or doubts or misgivings of any sort, and having George at her side again, was not afraid of any heiress or beauty or indeed any sort of danger. When Captain Dauben came back in the afternoon to these people, which he did with a great deal of sympathy for them, it did his heart good to see how Amelia had grown young again, how she laughed and chirped and sang familiar old songs at the piano, which were only interrupted by the bell from without proclaiming Mr. Sedley's return from the city, before whom George received a signal to retreat. Beyond the first smile of recognition, and even that was an hypocrisy, for she thought his arrival rather provoking, Miss Sedley did not once notice Dauben during his visit, but he was content so that he saw her happy, and thankful to have been the means of making her so. Chapter 21. A Quarrel About an Heiress. Love may be felt for any young lady endowed with such qualities as Miss Swartz possessed, and a great dream of ambition entered into old Mr. Osborne's soul, which she was to realize. He encouraged, with the utmost enthusiasm and friendliness, his daughter's amiable attachment to the young heiress, and protested that it gave him the sincerest pleasure, as a father, to see the love of his girls so well disposed. You won't find, he would say to Miss Rhoda, that splendor and rank to which you are accustomed at the West End, my dear miss, at our humble mansion in Russell Square. My daughters are plain, disinterested girls, but their hearts are in the right place. and they've conceived an attachment for you, which does them honor. I say, which does them honor. I'm a plain, simple, humble British merchant, an honest one, as my respected friends Hulker and Bullock will vouch, who were the correspondents of your late lamented father. You'll find us a united, simple, happy, and I think I may say respected family. A plain table, a plain people, but a warm welcome, my dear Miss Rhoda. Rhoda, let me say, for my heart warms to you. It does, really. I'm a frank man, and I like you. A glass of champagne. Hicks, champagne to Miss Swartz. There is little doubt that old Osborne believed all he said, and that the girls were quite earnest in their protestations of affection for Miss Swartz. People in Vanity Fair fasten on to rich folks quite naturally. If the simplest people are disposed to look not a little kindly on great prosperity, for I defy any member of the British public to say that the notion of wealth has not something awful and pleasing to him, and you, if you are told that the man next to you at dinner has got $500,000, not to look at him with a certain interest. If the simple look benevolently on money, how much more do your old worldlings regard it? Their affections rush out to meet and welcome money. Their kind sentiments awaken spontaneously towards the interesting possessors of it. I know some respectable people who don't consider themselves at liberty to indulge in friendship for any individual who has not a certain competency or place in society. They give a loose to their feelings on proper occasions, and the proof is that the major part of the Osborne family, who had not in 15 years been able to get up a hearty regard for Amelia Sedley, became as fond of Miss Swartz in the course of a single evening as the most romantic advocate of friendship at first sight could desire. What a match for George she'd be, the sisters and Miss Wirt agreed, and how much better than that insignificant little Amelia. Such a dashing young fellow as he is, with his good looks, rank, and accomplishments, would be the very husband for her. Visions of balls in Portland Place, presentations at court, and introductions to half the peerage filled the minds of the young ladies, who talked of nothing but George and his grand acquaintances to their beloved new friend. Old Osborne thought she would be a great match, too, for his son. He should leave the army, he should go into Parliament, he should cut a figure in the fashion and in the state. His blood boiled with honest British exultation as he saw the name of Osborne ennobled in the person of his son, and thought that he might be the progenitor of a glorious line of baronets. He worked in the city and on 'Change until he knew everything relating to the fortune of the heiress, how her money was placed, and where her estates lay. Young Fred Bullock, one of his chief informants, would have liked to make a bid for her himself. It was so the young banker expressed it. Only he was booked to Maria Osborne. But not being able to secure her as a wife, the disinterested Fred quite approved of her as a sister-in-law. Let George cut in directly and win her, was his advice. Strike while the iron's hot, while she's fresh to the town. In a few weeks, some damned fellow from the West End will come in with a title and a rotten rent roll and cut all us city men out, as Lord Fitzrufus did last year with Mrs. Gogram, who was actually engaged to Potter of Potter and Brown's. The sooner it is done, the better, Mr. Osborne. Them's my sentiments, the wag said. Though, when Osborne left the bank parlor, Mr. Bullock remembered Amelia, and what a pretty girl she was, and how attached to George Osborne, and he gave up at least 10 seconds of his valuable time to regretting the misfortune which had befallen that unlucky young woman. While thus George Osborne's good feelings and his good friend and genius Dauben were carrying back the truant to Amelia's feet, George's parents and sisters were arranging this splendid match for him, which they never dreamed he would resist. When the elder Osborne gave what he called a hint, there was no possibility for the most obtuse to mistake his meaning. He called kicking a footman downstairs a hint to the latter to leave his service. With his usual frankness and delicacy, he told Mrs. Haggerston that he would give her a cheque for £5,000 on the day his son was married to her ward, and called that proposal a hint, and considered it a very dexterous piece of diplomacy. He gave George finally such another hint regarding the heiress, and ordered him to marry her out of hand, as he would have ordered his butler to draw a cork, or his clerk to write a letter. This imperative hint disturbed George a great deal. He was in the very first enthusiasm and delight of his second courtship of Amelia, which was inexpressibly sweet to him. The contrast of her manners and appearance with those of the heiress made the idea of a union with the latter appear doubly ludicrous and odious. Carriages and opera boxes, thought he. Fancy being seen in them by the side of such a mahogany charmer as that. Add to all that the junior Osborne was quite as obstinate as the senior. When he wanted a thing, quite as firm in his resolution to get it, and quite as violent when angered, as his father in his most stern moments. On the first day, when his father formally gave him the hint that he was to place his affections at Miss Swartz's feet, George temporized with the old gentleman. "You should have thought of the matter sooner, sir," he said. "It can't be done now, when we're expecting every day to go on foreign service. Wait till my return, if I do return." And then he represented that the time when the regiment was daily expecting to quit England was exceedingly ill chosen, that the few days or weeks during which they were still to remain at home must be devoted to business and not to love-making. Time enough for that when he came home with his majority. "For I promise you," said he, with a satisfied air, "that one way or other you shall read the name of George Osborne in the Gazette." The father's reply to this was founded upon the information which he had got in the city, that the West End chaps would infallibly catch hold of the heiress if any delay took place, that if he didn't marry Miss S., he might at least have an engagement in writing to come in effect when he returned to England, and that a man who could get 10,000 a year by staying at home was a fool to risk his life abroad. "So that you would have me shown up as a coward, sir, and our name dishonored for the sake of Miss Swartz's money," George interposed. This remark staggered the old gentleman, but as he had to reply to it, and as his mind was nevertheless made up, he said, "You will dine here tomorrow, sir, and every day Miss Swartz comes, you will be here to pay your respects to her. If you want for money, call upon Mr. Chopper." Thus, a new obstacle was in George's way to interfere with his plans regarding Amelia, and about which he and Dauben had more than one confidential consultation. His friend's opinion respecting the line of conduct which he ought to pursue, we know already. And as for Osborne, when he was once bent on a thing, a fresh obstacle or two only rendered him the more resolute. The dark object of the conspiracy into which the chiefs of the Osborne family had entered was quite ignorant of all their plans regarding her, which, strange to say, her friend and chaperone did not divulge. And taking all the young lady's flattery for genuine sentiment, and being, as we have before had occasion to show, of a very warm and impetuous nature, responded to their affection with quite a tropical ardor. And if the truth may be told, I dare say that she too had some selfish attraction in the Russell Square house, and in a word, thought George Osborne a very nice young man. His whiskers had made an impression upon her on the very first night she beheld them at the ball at Messrs. Holker's, and, as we know, she was not the first woman who had been charmed by them. George had an air at once swaggering and melancholy, languid and fierce. He looked like a man who had passions, secrets, and private harrowing griefs and adventures. His voice was rich and deep. He would say it was a warm evening, or ask his partner to take an ice, with a tone as sad and confidential as if he were breaking her mother's death to her, or preluding a declaration of love. He trampled over all the young bucks of his father's circle, and was the hero among those third-rate men. Some few sneered at him and hated him. Some, like Dauben, fanatically admired him, and his whiskers had begun to do their work and to curl themselves round the affections of Miss Swartz. Whenever there was a chance of meeting him in Russell Square, that simple and good-natured young woman was quite in a flurry to see her dear Mrs. Osborne. She went to great expenses in new gowns and bracelets and bonnets and in prodigious feathers. She adorned her person with her utmost skill to please the conqueror, and exhibited all her simple accomplishments to win his favor. The girls would ask her with the greatest gravity for a little music, and she would sing her 3 songs and play her 2 little pieces as often as ever they asked, and with an always increasing pleasure to herself. During these delectable entertainments, Miss Wirt and the chaperone sate by, and conned over the peerage, and talked about the nobility. The day after George had his hint from his father, and a short time before the hour of dinner, he was lolling upon a sofa in the drawing-room, in a very becoming and perfectly natural attitude of melancholy. He had been, at his father's request, to Mr. Chopper in the city. The old gentleman, though he gave great sums to his son, would never specify any fixed allowance for him, and rewarded him only as he was in the humor. He had then been to pass 3 hours with Amelia, his dear little Amelia, at Fulham. And he came home to find his sisters spread in starched muslin in the drawing-room, the dowagers cackling in the background, and honest Swartz in her favorite amber-colored satin, with turquoise bracelets, countless rings, flowers, feathers, and all sorts of tags and gimcracks, about as elegantly decorated as a she chimney-sweep on May Day. The girls, after vain attempts to engage him in conversation, talked about fashions, and the last drawing-room until he was perfectly sick of their chatter. He contrasted their behavior with little Emmy's, their shrill voices with her tender ringing tones, their attitudes and their elbows and their starch with her humble soft movements and modest graces. Poor Swartz was seated in a place where Emmy had been accustomed to sit. Her bejeweled hands lay sprawling in her amber satin lap. Her tags and earrings twinkled, and her big eyes rolled about. She was doing nothing with perfect contentment, and thinking herself charming. Anything so becoming as the satin the sisters had never seen. "Dammy," George said to a confidential friend, "she looked like a china doll, which has nothing to do all day but to grin and wag its head. By Jove, Will, it was all I could do to prevent myself from throwing the sofa cushion at her." He restrained that exhibition of sentiment, however. The sisters began to play the Battle of Prague. "Stop that damned thing," George howled out in a fury from the sofa. "It makes me mad. You play us something, Miss Swartz, do. Sing something, anything, but the Battle of Prague." "Shall I sing Blue-Eyed Mary or the air from the cabinet?" Miss Swartz asked. "That sweet thing from the cabinet," the sisters said. "We've had that," replied the misanthrope on the sofa. "I can sing Fluvi du Teji," Swartz said in a meek voice, "if I had the words." It was the last of the worthy young woman's collection. "Oh, Fluv de Taga," Miss Maria cried, "we have the song," and went off to fetch the book in which it was. Now it happened that this song, then in the height of the fashion, had been given to the young ladies by a young friend of theirs, whose name was on the title, and Miss Swartz, having concluded the ditty with George's applause, for he remembered that it was a favorite of Amelia's, was hoping for an encore, perhaps, and fiddling with the leaves of the music when her eye fell upon the title and she saw Amelia Sedley written in the corner. "Lor!" cried Miss Swartz, spinning swiftly round on the music stool. "Is it my Amelia?" "Amelia that was at Miss P.'s at Hammersmith. I know it's her. It's her, and tell me about her. Where is she?" "Don't mention her," Miss Maria Osborne said hastily. "Her family has disgraced itself. Her father cheated Papa, and as for her, she is never to be mentioned here." This was Miss Maria's return for George's rudeness about the Battle of Prague. "Are you a friend of Amelia's?" George said, bouncing up. "God bless you for it, Miss Swartz. Don't believe what the girls say. She's not to blame at any rate. She's the best—" "You know you're not to speak about her, George," cried Jane. "Papa forbids it." "Who's to prevent me?" George cried out. "I will speak of her. I say she's the best, the kindest, the gentlest, the sweetest girl in England, and that bankrupt or no, my sisters are not fit to hold candles to her. If you like her, go and see her, Miss Swartz. She wants friends now, and I say, God bless everybody who befriends her. Anybody who speaks kindly of her is my friend. Anybody who speaks against her is my enemy. Thank you, Miss Swartz." And he went up and wrung her hand. "George, George!" one of the sisters cried imploringly. "I say," George said fiercely, "I thank everybody who loves Amelia said—" He stopped. Old Osborne was in the room with a face livid with rage and eyes like hot coals. Though George had stopped in his sentence, yet, his blood being up, he was not to be cowed by all the generations of Osborne. Rallying instantly, he replied to the bullying look of his father, with another so indicative of resolution and defiance that the older man quailed in his turn and looked away. He felt that the tussle was coming. "Mrs. Haggiston, let me take you down to dinner," he said. "Give your arm to Miss Swartz, George." And they marched. "Miss Swartz, I love Amelia, and we've been engaged almost all our lives," Osborne said to his partner, and during all the dinner. George rattled on with a volubility which surprised himself, and made his father doubly nervous for the fight which was to take place as soon as the ladies were gone. The difference between the pair was that while the father was violent and a bully, the son had thrice the nerve and courage of the parent, and could not merely make an attack, but resist it. And finding that the moment was now come when the contest between him and his father was to be decided, he took his dinner with perfect coolness and appetite before the engagement began. Old Osborne, on the contrary, was nervous and drank much. He floundered in his conversation with the ladies, his neighbors, George's coolness only rendering him more angry. It made him half mad to see the calm way in which George, flapping his napkin, and with a swaggering bow, opened the door for the ladies to leave the room, and filling himself a glass of wine, smacked it, and looked his father full in the face as if to say, "Gentlemen of the guard fire first." The old man also took a supply of ammunition, but his decanter clinked against the glass as he tried to fill it. After giving a great heave and with a purple choking face, he then began, "How dare you, sir, mention that person's name before Miss Swartz today, in my drawing room? I ask you, sir, how dare you do it?" "Stop, sir," says George. "Don't say dare, sir. Dare isn't a word to be used to a captain in the British Army." "I shall say what I like to my son, sir. I can cut him off with a shilling if I like. I can make him a beggar if I like. I will say what I like," the elder said. "I'm a gentleman, though. I am your son, sir," George answered haughtily. "Any communications which you have to make to me, or any orders which you may please to give, I beg may be couched in that kind of language which I am accustomed to hear." Whenever the lad assumed his haughty manner, it always created either great awe or great irritation in the parent. Old Osborne stood in secret terror of his son as a better gentleman than himself, and perhaps my readers may have remarked in their experience of this Vanity Fair of ours that there is no character which a low-minded man so much mistrusts as that of a gentleman. My father didn't give me the education you have had, nor the advantages you have had, nor the money you have had. If I had kept the company some folks have had through my means, perhaps my son wouldn't have any reason to brag, sir, of his superiority and West End airs. These words were uttered in the elder Osborne's most sarcastic tones. But it wasn't considered the part of a gentleman, in my time, for a man to insult his father. If I'd done any such thing, mine would have kicked me downstairs, sir. I never insulted you, sir. I said I begged you to remember your son was a gentleman as well as yourself. I know very well that you give me plenty of money, said George, fingering a bundle of notes which he had got in the morning from Mr. Chopper. You tell it me often enough, sir. There's no fear of my forgetting it. I wish you'd remember other things as well, sir, the sire answered. I wish you'd remember that in this house, so long as you choose to honor it with your company, Captain, I'm the master, and that name, and that I say. That what, sir? George asked, with scarcely a sneer, filling another glass of claret. Burst out his father with a screaming oath, that the name of those Sedleys never be mentioned here, sir. Not one of the whole damned lot of 'em, sir. It wasn't I, sir, that introduced Miss Sedley's name. It was my sisters who spoke ill of her to Miss Swartz, and by Jove, I'll defend her wherever I go. Nobody shall speak lightly of that name in my presence. Our family has done her quite enough injury already, I think, and may leave off reviling her now she's down. I'll shoot any man but you who says a word against her. Go on, sir, go on, the old gentleman said, his eyes starting out of his head. Go on about what, sir? About the way in which we've treated that angel of a girl. Who told me to love her? It was your doing. I might have chosen elsewhere and looked higher, perhaps, than your society, but I obeyed you. And now that her heart's mine, you give me orders to fling it away and punish her, kill her, perhaps, for the faults of other people. It's a shame, by heavens, said George, working himself up into passion and enthusiasm as he proceeded, to play it fast and loose with a young girl's affections, and with such an angel as that, one so superior to the people amongst whom she lived, that she might have excited envy. Only she was so good and gentle that it's a wonder anybody dared to hate her. If I desert her, sir, do you suppose she forgets me? I ain't gonna have any of this damned sentimental nonsense and humbug here, sir, the father cried out. There shall be no beggar marriages in my family. If you choose to fling away 8,000 a year, which you may have for the asking, you may do it. But by Jove, you take your pack and walk out of this house, sir. Will you do as I tell you, once and for all, sir, or will you not? Marry that mulatto woman, George said, pulling up his shirt collars. I don't like the color, sir. Ask the black that sweeps opposite Fleet Market, sir. I'm not going to marry a Hottentot Venus. Mr. Osborne pulled frantically at the cord by which he was accustomed to summon the butler when he wanted wine, and almost black in the face, ordered that functionary to call a coach for Captain Osborne. I've done it, said George, coming into the Slaughters an hour afterwards, looking very pale. What, my boy? Says Dauben. George told what had passed between his father and himself. I'll marry her tomorrow, he said with an oath. I love her more every day, Dauben. Chapter 22. A Marriage and Part of a Honeymoon. Enemies, the most obstinate and courageous, can't hold out against starvation. So the elder Osborne felt himself pretty easy about his adversary in the encounter we have just described, and as soon as George's supplies fell short, confidently expected his unconditional submission. It was unlucky, to be sure, that the lad should have secured a stock of provisions on the very day when the first encounter took place, But this relief was only temporary, old Osborne thought, and would but delay George's surrender. No communication passed between father and son for some days. The former was sulky at this silence, but not disquieted, for, as he said, he knew where he could put the screw upon George, and only waited the result of that operation. He told the sisters the upshot of the dispute between them, but ordered them to take no notice of the matter, and welcomed George on his return as if nothing had happened. His cover was laid as usual every day, and perhaps the old gentleman rather anxiously expected him, but he never came. Someone inquired at the Slaughterses regarding him, where it was said that he and his friend Captain Dauben had left town. One gusty, raw day at the end of April, the rain whipping the pavement of that ancient street where the old Slaughter's coffee house was once situated, George Osborne came into the coffee room, looking very haggard and pale, although dressed rather smartly in a blue coat and brass buttons, and a neat buff waistcoat of the fashion of those days. Here was his friend, Captain Dauben, in blue and brass too, having abandoned the military frock and French grey trousers, which were the usual coverings of his lanky person. Dauben had been in the coffee room for an hour or more. He had tried all the papers, but could not read them. He had looked at the clock many scores of times, and at the street, where the rain was pattering down, and the people, as they clinked by in pattens, left long reflections on the shining stone. He tattooed at the table. He bit his nails most completely, and nearly to the quick. He was accustomed to ornament his great big hands in this way. He balanced the teaspoon dexterously on the milk jug, upset it, etc., etc., and in fact showed those signs of disquietude, and practiced those desperate attempts at amusement which men are accustomed to employ when very anxious and expectant and perturbed in mind. Some of his comrades, gentlemen who used the room, joked him about the splendor of his costume and his agitation of manner. One asked him if he was going to be married. Dauben laughed and said he would send his acquaintance, Major Wagstaff of the Engineers, a piece of cake when that event took place. At length, Captain Osborne made his appearance, very smartly dressed, but very pale and agitated, as we have said. He wiped his pale face with a large yellow bandana pocket handkerchief that was prodigiously scented. He shook hands with Dauben, looked at the clock, and told John the waiter to bring him some curacao. Of this cordial he swallowed off a couple glasses with nervous eagerness. His friend asked with some interest about his health. "Couldn't get a wink of sleep till daylight, Daub," said he. "Infernal headache and fever. Got up at 9, went down to the hammams for a bath. I say, Daub, I feel just as I did on the morning I went out with Rocket at Quebec." "So do I," William responded. "I was a deuced deal more nervous than you were that morning. You made a famous breakfast, I remember. Eat something now." "Oh, you're a good old fellow, Will. I'll drink your health, old boy, and farewell to—" No, 2 glasses are enough," Dauben interrupted him. "Here, take away the liquors, John. Have some cayenne pepper with your fowl. Make haste, though, for it is time we were there." It was about half an hour from 12 when this brief meeting and colloquy took place between the two captains. A coach, into which Captain Osborne's servant put his master's desk and dressing case, had been in waiting for some time, and into this the 2 gentlemen hurried under an umbrella, and the valet mounted on the box, cursing the rain and the dampness of the coachman, who was steaming beside him. "We shall find a better trap than this at the church door," says he. "That's a comfort." And the carriage drove on, taking the road down Piccadilly, where Apsley House and St. George's Hospital wore red jackets still, where there were oil lamps, where Achilles was not yet born, nor the Pimlico arch raised, nor the hideous equestrian monster which pervades it and the neighborhood. And so they drove down by Brompton to a certain chapel near the Fulham Road there. A chariot was in waiting with 4 horses, Likewise, a coach of the kind called glass coaches. Only a very few idlers were collected on account of the dismal rain. "Hang it," said George, "I said only a pair." "My master would have 4, said Mr. John Sedley's servant, who was in waiting, and he and Mr. Osborne's man agreed, as they followed George and William into the church, that it was a reg'lar shabby turnout, and with no scarce so much as a breakfast or a wedding favour. "Here you are," said our old friend, Joe Sedley, coming forward. "You're 5 minutes late, George, my boy. What a day, eh? Dimmy, it's like the commencement of the rainy seasons in Bengal. You'll find my carriage is watertight. Come along, my mother and Emmy are in the vestry." Joe Sedley was splendid. He was fatter than ever. His shirt collars were higher, his face was redder. His shirt frill flaunted gorgeously out of his variegated waistcoat. Varnished boots were not invented as yet, but the Hessians on his beautiful legs shone so that they must have been the identical pair in which the gentleman in the old picture used to shave himself, and on his light green coat there bloomed a fine wedding favor, like a great white spreading magnolia. In a word, George had thrown the great cast. He was going to be married. Hence his pallor and nervousness, his sleepless night and agitation in the morning. I have heard people who gone through the same thing own to the same emotion. After 3 or 4 ceremonies, you get accustomed to it, no doubt, but the first dip, everybody allows, is awful. The bride was dressed in a brown silk pelisse, as Captain Dauben has since informed me, and wore a straw bonnet with a pink ribbon. Over the bonnet she had a veil of white Chantilly lace, a gift from Mr. Joseph Sedley, her brother. Captain Dauben himself had asked leave to present her with a gold chain and watch, which she sported on this occasion, and her mother gave her her diamond brooch, almost the only trinket which was left to the old lady. As the service went on, Mrs. Sedley sat and whimpered a great deal in a pew, consoled by the Irish maidservant and Mrs. Clapp from the lodgings. Old Sedley would not be present. Jos acted for his father, giving away the bride, whilst Captain Dauben stepped up as groomsman to his friend George. There was nobody in the church besides the officiating persons and the small marriage party and their attendants. The 2 valets sat aloof superciliously. The rain came rattling down on the windows. In the intervals of the service you heard it, and the sobbing of old Mrs. Sedley in the pew. The parson's tones echoed sadly through the empty walls. Osborne's "I will" was sounded in very deep bass. Emmy's response came fluttering up to her lips from her heart, but was scarcely heard by anybody except Captain Dauben. When the service was completed, Joe Sedley came forward and kissed his sister, the bride, for the first time for many months. George's look of gloom had gone, and he seemed quite proud and radiant. "It's your turn, William," said he, putting his hand fondly upon Dauben's shoulder, and Dauben went up and touched Amelia on the cheek. Then they went into the vestry and signed the register. "God bless you, old Dauben," George said, grasping him by the hand, with something very like moisture glistening in his eyes. William replied only by nodding his head. His heart was too full to say much. "Write directly, and come down as soon as you can, you know," Osborne said, after Mrs. Sedley had taken an hysterical adieu of her daughter. The pair went off to the carriage. "Get out of the way, you little devils," George cried to a small crowd of damp urchins that were hanging about the chapel door. The rain drove into the bride and bridegroom's faces as they passed to the chariot. The postilions' favors draggled on their dripping jackets. The few children made a dismal cheer as the carriage, splashing mud, drove away. William Dauben stood in the church porch, looking at it, a queer figure. The small crew of spectators jeered him. He was not thinking about them or their laughter. "Come home and have some tiffin, Dauben," a voice cried behind him, as a pudgy hand was laid on his shoulder, and the honest fellow's reverie was interrupted. But the captain had no heart to go a-feasting with Joe Sedley. He put the weeping old lady and her attendants into the carriage along with Jos, and left them without any farther words passing. This carriage, too, drove away, and the urchins gave another sarcastical cheer. "Here, you little beggars," Dauben said, giving some 6 pences amongst them, and then went off by himself through the rain. It was all over. They were married and happy, he prayed God. Never since he was a boy had he felt so miserable and so lonely. He longed with a heartsick yearning for the first few days to be over, that he might see her again. Some 10 days after the above ceremony, 3 young men of our acquaintance were enjoying that beautiful prospect of bow windows on one side and blue sea on the other, which Brighton affords to the traveler. Sometimes it is towards the ocean, smiling with countless dimples, speckled with white sails, with 100 bathing machines kissing the skirt of his blue garment, that the Londoner looks enraptured. Sometimes, on the contrary, a lover of human nature rather than of prospects of any kind, it is towards the bow windows that he turns, and that swarm of human life which they exhibit. From one issue, the notes of a piano,